The October sunlight poured through the glass walls of my wife's office as I placed a letter on her desk and smiled. After 30 years of service, I had finally received the appointment that should have been the proudest moment of my life. She barely glanced at it. "Your little promotion means absolutely nothing," she said coldly. I remained rooted to the spot, still waiting for her eyes to find mine. That's when boots landed hard against the hallway floor. The office door burst open, and a cluster of FBI agents filed in. What I saw on my wife's face in that moment cut deeper than the arrest ever could. She already knew they were coming. Welcome back to Father's silent revenge. The place where the stories no one dared tell finally find their voice. If you're new here, stay close and follow along for more stories like this one. Before we go any further, are you listening on headphones today or letting it play out loud through a speaker? It matters because a story this heavy deserves to find you exactly where you are. A quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling, and any resemblance to real persons is entirely coincidental. It's the truth underneath the story that counts. What matters is the lesson buried at the heart of it. That morning, I carried the official appointment letter up to Lydia's office, first Monday of October, a Chicago day so clear and cold bright that I'd let myself believe something good was finally arriving. Riding that elevator to the 34th floor, I noticed a lightness I hadn't felt in years. 60 years old, lean, my close-cropped hair gone entirely white at the temples, wire-framed bifocals catching the autumn light as it broke through the tower's glass facade. 3 decades at the Department of Defense auditing contracts, safeguarding the infrastructure this country runs on, and the formal appointment had finally come through. Every late night, every weekend, surrendered every cost Lydia had absorbed. While I chased something worth building, all of it was supposed to mean something now. Special Advisor for Government Audits, Senate confirmed. The kind of authority that lets you reach corruption at its source. I stepped into her corner office holding that letter, the way a man carries something fragile and precious. Lydia Avery, my wife of 22 years, presided behind a marble desk, large enough to land a small aircraft. Blonde highlights drinking in the October sun and shaving years off her 52. Armani charcoal gray with ivory trim pearl drop earrings that cost more than my first car. Her windows looked straight out over Millennium Park, 34 floors of loop real estate, announcing a kind of achievement I'd never had the vocabulary for. She ran compliance at Apex Meridian Capital, pulling 3 times my government salary, occupying the room with the effortless authority I'd spent 30 years reaching for. "Lydia," I said, sliding the letter across that vast marble expanse. "It's official. The Senate confirmed it this morning." 1 second, maybe 2, that's all she gave it before dropping the document onto the desk, as though it were a parking stub. "That petty title means absolutely nothing, Conrad," she said, her eyes already back on the screen. I stood there, hand still, floating in the space where the letter had been, feeling warmth drain from the room like a window had been thrown open in January. This woman had slept beside me for 22 years. She'd sat through every DOD ceremony, held her smile through every modest promotion. And now she'd dismissed the defining achievement of my career the way you dismiss a weather forecast. "Lydia, I thought you'd—" Hard footfalls on the marble corridor cut me off. The glass door opened with a sharp, clean click, and my throat locked the moment I recognized the man in front. Mick Beaumont, 58, built broad silver crew, cut a face like something hammered out of stone by a sculptor who'd given up on softness, came through the door in scuffed black Oxfords that had walked 1,000 crime scenes. Flanking him, 2 FBI field agents in dark suits, their expressions carrying that particular blankness that tells you every decision has already been made. 25 years, Mick and I. He'd been a junior prosecutor when we first met. I was a DOD auditor on the stand in a fraud case. We'd watched our kids become adults. We'd traded bourbon on the bad nights and shared coffee on the worse ones. I knew his tells knew precisely how his jaw set when he was about to break someone's world apart. It was set that way now. Conrad Harlan Avery. Mick said, his voice stripped of everything personal federal authority, filling every syllable and dissolving 25 years between us in a single breath. You are under arrest for violations under 18 U.S.C. relating to unauthorized disclosure of classified defense information and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Each word landed like something thrown from a height. A ringing took hold of my ears. That crystalline October morning beyond Lydia's windows had become a foreign country. How does a man travel from appointment to arrest in less than 5 minutes? Check-a-new. My voice came out thin, as if it belonged to someone in the next room. What are you talking about? One agent moved forward and unclipped steel handcuffs from his belt. Digital evidence recovered from your home computer. Mick went on, and underneath the official cadence, I could hear the fracture, the way his voice caught on the word home like it snagged on a nail. Classified DoD procurement files transmitted to offshore accounts. Wire transfers totaling $4.2 million, traced to shell companies linked to a private military contractor currently under federal investigation. That's insane, I said, but the agent's hands were already at my wrists. Mick, you know me. You know I would never. Turn around, Mr. Avery. Quiet. Absolute. I turned. Cold steel closed around my left wrist, then my right. The sound those cuffs made locking shut was the most solitary sound I have ever known. 25 years had taught me that Mick Beaumont had no room to move when the evidence presented itself as airtight. He was executing an order following the chain, carrying out a warrant some federal judge had signed after reviewing whatever digital architecture someone had assembled to look like me. But Lydia's face was a separate document entirely. I looked across that marble desk at my wife and waited for shock, for revulsion, for some fragment of the woman who had married me and might grieve what was happening. Lydia didn't flinch. Not one tear. What I caught just a sliver of a second before composure locked back down was the edge of a smirk. Not bewilderment. Not disbelief. Familiarity. She had been waiting for this knock. I'm sorry, Conrad, Mick said under his breath as the agents turned me toward the door. I stole one last look at Lydia. Her fingers were already back on the keyboard, face tipped toward the monitor, as though the scene behind her had already been filed and closed. The letter 30 years distilled into a single page lay beside her coffee cup on that enormous desk, forgotten before I'd cleared the room. And as they walked me out past assistants who froze and stared and murmured, the full shape of it settled over me. This had never been a morning of arrival. It was a morning I had been delivered right on schedule to a machine that had been grinding toward this moment long before I walked through Lydia's door. The question that would never stop pressing on me was the simple, terrible one. How long had she been waiting for me to walk in? From the transport van, I went straight to a holding cell. 2:30 in the afternoon, cheap floor wax, old paper, the particular stale cold of institutional air, a smell I will carry for the rest of my life, as the scent of the moment my freedom was auctioned off. The question of how far back Lydia's planning reached would have to keep. What couldn't wait was staying out of federal detention for the 18 months until trial. Harlow Price materialized on the video link at exactly 3:15, appearing from his glass office in a crisp cobalt blue bow tie, speaking at a velocity that made stenographers sweat. 35 years old already, the kind of name federal prosecutors whispered about with grudging respect. He'd answered my single call from the transport van with a brisk, practiced calm that suggested this wasn't altogether a surprise. "Your Honor." Harlow began his sentences, compressing into each other like cars in a pileup, while Judge Aldous Breck gazed down from the bench through horn-rimmed glasses. "Skitselaux. My client has dedicated 3 decades to protecting this nation's financial integrity. He is not a flight risk. He is a pillar of this community." Judge Breck was 63, and his face bore the specific exhaustion of a man who had absorbed every performance the federal system stages. He moved through the arrest documents with a methodical patience, a man who had sentenced 1,000 people and was in no hurry because there would be 1,000 more. "The government alleges transmission of classified procurement data to offshore entities," he said, voice carrying no more heat than a recorded announcement. $4.2 million in wire transfers. That suggests sophisticated planning, Mr. Price. "Allegations," Harlow shot back without hesitation. "Not evidence. Not proof. My client maintains complete innocence and will contest every charge aggressively." I occupied the defendant's chair in the same clothes I'd dressed in that morning, to mark a celebration clothes from a lifetime ago, a parallel world. The ankle monitor locked on during processing bit into my right leg, 142 grams of black composite carrying a weight no number could explain after 30 years of a clean record. Then Mick Beaumont rose at the prosecution table. "Your Honor," he said, and the quality of his voice pulled my attention up from the floor. "The arresting agent has submitted an unusual formal investigative memorandum for the court's consideration." Both of Judge Breck's eyebrows moved just slightly, the professional surface showing its first seam. Mick passed the document to the clerk. I watched the judge read, watched his pace slow, as something in the pages held him. Whatever Mick had put into that memorandum sat well outside normal procedure. An arresting agent does not typically write on behalf of the man he just put in cuffs. The memorandum notes Mr. Avery's extensive cooperation during arrest. Judge Breck read aloud, measured and deliberate, and cites his 30-year record of service with 0 prior criminal history or disciplinary actions. It suggests that pre-trial detention may be unnecessarily punitive given the circumstances. Harlow was already on his feet. "Your Honor, this corroborates our position. Even the arresting agent recognizes it. Bail is granted." Judge Breck cut in gavel already descending. $2 million property bond secured against verified assets, ankle monitor, home confinement. 24/7 location tracking, next case. The entire hearing ran 11 minutes. Harlow caught up with me in the corridor outside the courtroom and held out his phone. Imani Thorpe, a 38-year-old investigative journalist, whose breaking piece had racked up 14,000 shares before the cuffs were even off my wrists, had published under the headline, "DOD Advisor Arrested in Massive Procurement Fraud Scheme." My official portrait from the Senate confirmation hearing stared up at me above 3 paragraphs of surgical allegations that stopped just shy of libel. Senator Beckett put out a statement. Harlow said, his voice low. "Deep disappointment and full faith in the justice system," which meant my political sponsor had just stepped off the boat and let me sink rather than get his shoes wet. There's a particular irony in this. Strangers, people who'd read a nameplate or seen a badge, had shown more genuine regard for my 30 years of service than my own family ever managed. And now even that was being fed into a shredder in real time, across platforms by people who had never sat across a table from me, never watched me work, never understood what it actually costs a man to hold the line. The FBI transport deposited me at my Lincoln Park townhouse at 7:00 that evening. The building waited in total darkness against the October dusk. I got the front door open, with hands trembling from adrenaline running dry, and walked into a silence so complete It pressed against my ears. Lydia had conducted a scorched earth withdrawal. The walk-in closet gaped empty on her side, stripped to bare cedar, nothing remaining but the ghost of her perfume. The refrigerator had been scoured clean. Every photograph was gone from the walls, every object that testified to 22 years of her presence vanished. On the kitchen island sat a white envelope, crisp as a summons. I opened it with fingers that had gone from shaking to simply numb. Formal divorce notice filed in New York's Supreme Court matrimonial part. Automatic orders under Domestic Relations Law, Section 236, effective immediately, freezing all marital assets and joint accounts, pending equitable distribution. The language was precise, efficient, and designed to cauterize. Lydia had filed that paperwork before they'd even transported me to the courthouse while I was still wearing the handcuffs. She had been erasing me with the calm methodology of someone who'd been planning the erasure for a long time. I tried my primary credit card. Declined. The joint checking account. Access denied. I called her cell phone. The number had been disconnected. 22 years of marriage, and she'd disassembled every shared piece of it in under 8 hours. I slid down onto the kitchen floor, back flat against the refrigerator that used to hold our family photographs, and stared at the ankle monitor's small green light blinking in the dark. Every 30 seconds it chirped, confirming my coordinates to some federal server in some building I'd never see, reminding me of what I had become. The isolation of that moment was its own particular weight, alone in a house picked clean of everything that had made it livable, charged with crimes I hadn't committed, left by everyone who'd had any obligation to stay. It felt like drowning without water. Then the doorbell went. I pushed myself upright off the floor, every joint stiff, and walked to the door, braced for process. Servers, reporters, or agents arriving with a fresh set of charges. Instead, Ezra Quimby stood on the step in a gray hoodie with Bose headphones around his neck, hauling 2 backpacks of server equipment with the calm of someone who had already accounted for this in his plans. He was 25 years old, the son of a former DoD colleague of mine who'd passed away 3 years ago, and a forensic data analyst who dismantled encryption protocols the way other people work through a Sunday crossword. I didn't ask Ezra why he'd arrived at my door at 7:00 in the evening, loaded down with encrypted network gear, already knowing when I'd be dropped off. There are points in a man's life where you stop auditing the rope someone throws you and simply take hold. "How large is your basement?" Ezra asked, skipping any greeting or expression of sympathy. By 11:00 that night, I stood in the damp chill of my basement, watching a 25-year-old bring a 4th monitor online, trying to comprehend how a man's entire life could be stripped to the studs in under 14 hours. Ezra moved with the focused economy of someone rehearsing a procedure they'd already run through 100 times. He asked no permission. He offered no explanations. He simply transformed my low-ceilinged stone basement, the kind with one bare yellow bulb and foundation cracks that wept moisture each spring, into something resembling a tactical command center. 4 monitors arranged in a semicircle, a portable server rack humming against the far wall, Cat6 cables threading across the concrete floor like the veins of some improvised organism. The space filled with cold brew, concentrate, and energy drinks, which apparently fueled Ezra's brain better than food or rest. "The ankle monitor," Ezra said, eyes still fixed on a screen churning lines of code, "runs on localized GPS paired with an RF base station they mounted in your master bedroom. It sends cellular pings every 15 seconds to confirm your position." I looked down at the black composite band around my right leg and felt its weight as something that went past the physical. But the RF radius, Ezra continued pulling up a building schematic he'd obtained by means I chose not to examine, covers the full perimeter of the townhouse comfortably. You can work in the basement without tripping a violation alert. The federal monitoring software reads you as stationary within approved boundaries. Small mercy. I could at least fight back from beneath my own floor. Ezra's hands ran across 3 keyboards at once, pulling metadata logs from my confiscated laptop material. The FBI forensics unit had somehow left vulnerable to remote extraction. Watching him was like observing surgery performed on organs whose names you didn't know. "This is interesting," Ezra said after 90 minutes of silence. I had already learned that when Ezra described something as interesting, the translation for ordinary people was catastrophic. "Your machine wasn't breached from the outside?" he said, highlighting a timestamp on the center monitor. "No phishing email, no compromised site, no backdoor punched through your firewall." "Then where did the infection come in?" I asked. Ezra zoomed into a metadata signature, and I watched his jaw go tight. "The virus was planted directly from inside the house via the domestic Wi-Fi network," he said quietly. 8 months ago, February 14th to be precise, Valentine's Day. The basement seemed to drop another few degrees. A hardware keylogger, Ezra explained, surfacing packet logs revealing 8 months of unbroken data transmission. Invisible to standard antivirus because it operated below the software layer entirely. Every keystroke, every password, every classified file I'd opened on my home computer had been streaming continuously to an offshore server. I stared at those blinking timestamp logs and felt the full nausea of what they meant settle in. Whoever spent 8 months constructing my treason hadn't needed to touch a firewall because she had a key to the front door. Lydia had physical access to my laptop every single day. She knew my routine. She knew which days I worked from home. She knew the nights I'd fall asleep early with the computer left open on the kitchen counter. She'd built my prison from the inside out. "Can you trace the destination server?" I asked. Ezra's expression answered before his words did. "Routed through 7 proxy layers across 4 continents," he said. "Whoever designed this knew precisely how to vanish. This isn't the work of an amateur." For the next 6 days, Ezra and I lived like shadows in that basement running algorithms until my vision blurred. We hardly slept. We ate microwaved food on our feet. We tracked data patterns materializing and dissolving until Sunday arrived, and with it, the one weekly obligation that no federal indictment was ever going to take from me. I arranged pre-approved travel authorization from my probation officer, family care, strict mileage radius 2-hour maximum. Then I drove to Lakeside Memory Care in Evanston. Irene Avery, my 84-year-old mother, occupied her wingback chair in room 114, weathered hands folding and unfolding in her lap as she watched the television. Some days she placed me immediately. Other days she used my childhood name and asked whether I'd graduated high school yet. Alzheimer's had claimed most of her memories, but left her emotional center untouched. She recognized love even when faces had gone. The room carried lavender soap and clinical antiseptic, with a wide window that framed a manicured courtyard where autumn leaves gathered in tidy geometric drifts. "Connie," she said as I came through the door, her eyes sharper than I'd expected. "Your face looks hollowed. What's wrong?" Nurse Celeste, the quiet caregiver assigned to Irene's wing, moved through the room, checking vitals before slipping away to give us privacy. I settled close beside my mother, holding her worn hand without any idea how to begin. How do you tell an 84-year-old woman with a fragile heart that her son has been arrested for treason, that her daughter-in-law built the whole trap? A long, heavy quiet filled the room, broken only by the low murmur of television voices. Then Irene's eyes sharpened with that rare, fleeting clarity that Alzheimer's sometimes allows brief windows where the person you lost comes back entirely. "Connie," she whispered, her grip on my hand firmer than I expected. Do you remember what you told me when you took that job at Defense? You said you'd never let a liar look you in the eye and call you equal. Those words traveled 30 years and landed in exactly the right place. A minute later, the clarity dissolved. She turned back toward the television and asked whether I'd remembered to feed her cat an animal that had been gone for 15 years. I kissed her forehead and made the drive back to Lincoln Park, pulling into the driveway with 11 minutes to spare before curfew. My secure phone buzzed the moment the car stopped. An email from an encrypted, untraceable address. No sender. Subject line: the ledger they built on your name. Check the timestamps. No signature. Just a single attachment: transaction log 2019-2021. Etzel Zex. I sat there with the engine running, staring at that file on the screen. My mother's words were still moving through me. Who knew precisely what I needed to see at that exact moment, and why were they too frightened to put a name on it? I carried the laptop down the basement stairs practically at a run and dropped it in front of Ezra before I'd even caught my breath. He didn't ask questions. His hands were already at the keys. The anonymous Excel file opened with a soft click, and Ezra's face went pale green-white in the glow of 847 rows of financial data. The only sounds in that damp Lincoln Park basement were the mechanical rhythm of his keyboard, the hum of the server fans, and the faint gurgle of coffee going cold in a mug he'd stopped thinking about. "This is remarkable," Ezra said after 12 minutes of silence. I had learned to fear that word in his mouth. 847 lines of highly classified corporate transactions across 4 years. He moved through the data with the unhurried precision of a man who'd done this before. This is a masterpiece of structured layering. Lydia couldn't have designed this. I leaned over his shoulder and watched the pattern surface the way a constellation resolves when your eyes finally adjust scattered points, pulling into shape. Payments originated from a rogue defense PMC private military contractor, whose name I recognized from classified briefings I'd given 3 years ago. The money flowed into something called Vanguard Apex Capital Fund, then transferred down into Meridian Global Trade LLC, Lydia's company. From there, it filtered through a web of Cayman Island shell corporations, Seabreeze Holdings, Pacific Ventures International, before arriving in a bank account registered under my stolen credentials. Every transaction bore my forged digital signature. Every dollar had my fingerprints on it. Whoever architected this understood financial forensics well enough to know exactly what prosecutors require for a conviction. This wasn't ordinary fraud. It was a precision-built legal weapon constructed around my destruction. "Who commands this level of sophistication?" I asked. Ezra shook his head slowly. "Someone with deep knowledge of international banking regulations, cryptocurrency protocols, and DoD procurement systems. This person understands how federal audits are conducted, because they engineered the trail to hold up under one." I scanned the spreadsheet, and my eyes snagged on an entry at the very bottom that didn't belong with the rest. "That transaction," I said, putting my finger on the screen. "When was it executed?" Ezra highlighted the timestamp, and his face shifted. "Saturday afternoon," he said quietly. 48 hours after your arrest. 2.3 million moved out of Meridian into a brand new, unhosted crypto cold wallet. The network is still draining. A transfer of $2.3 million on a Saturday afternoon, while the company sits under federal scrutiny, isn't the behavior of a careful operator. It's panic. Someone stripping the vessel before it goes under. And people stripping a sinking ship always leave a trail. "They're scrambling," I said, and felt something kindle in my chest, the first real flicker of hope since the handcuffs had locked. Whoever sent me this file understood I'd spot that Saturday transaction. They were showing me the conspiracy was still moving, still exposed. Ezra pulled up blockchain analysis tools and began tracking the cold wallet's creation. Wallet generated at 2:47 p.m. Eastern on Saturday, he said. Funded 7 minutes later. No transaction history before that. Someone moving fast and cutting corners. For the first time in a week, I was looking at a crack, rather than solid concrete. I spent the rest of Sunday and all of Monday morning on that basement cot working through scenarios with Ezra, mapping the financial architecture, trying to identify who had the expertise and motive to construct something at this scale. I woke at 6:00 Monday morning to the only reassuring thing I'd seen in days, a public LinkedIn post from Colonel Clifford Dunbar that I managed to screenshot exactly 4 minutes before it disappeared from the internet for good. The post was plain and direct. I've known Conrad Avery for 28 years. Whatever the Department of Justice is leaking to the press is fundamentally wrong. Colonel Clifford Dunbar, 62 years old, had been my commanding officer during my first DoD assignment in the late 90s. He ran a defense consulting firm, now moved easily among senators and generals, and carried the kind of credibility that could actually shift things. Seeing those words on my screen, someone with genuine standing putting themselves between me and the narrative, felt like a breath of real air. Then the post was gone. I reached him on the burner line Ezra had built, routed through encrypted proxies. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying a tension I hadn't heard in him before. "Conrad," he said. "I'm sorry I had to pull it." "What happened?" A pause. The sound of a door being shut, then footsteps on hardwood. 20 minutes after it went up, Colonel Dunbar said, "I got an anonymous call from a spoofed DC number. Male voice. Completely calm. He said if the post wasn't taken down immediately, my consulting firm would be facing a retroactive 5-year federal tax audit starting that afternoon." I shut my eyes and felt the room contract around me. "I folded," Colonel Dunbar said. "I have 18 employees, Conrad. I couldn't put their futures at risk for a gesture." "I understand," I told him. And I did. That is how power operates when no one is watching it, not through force, but through the quiet, credible threat of bureaucratic destruction. "But I need you to hear something," Colonel Dunbar said, his voice dropping. "I managed to examine the 6 corrupted audit reports they used to build your arrest warrant. I know your signature, Conrad. I've been looking at it on documents for 3 decades. That digital hash code did not come from your terminal," he said. "The metadata signature is close, but it isn't yours. Someone forged it." My pulse jumped. This was the first hard, technical ground that could actually challenge the prosecution. "There's more," Colonel Dunbar said. "They're tracking you, Conrad. They had wind of Harlow Price's retainer within an hour of the transaction clearing. I have a contact at the defense bar who told me Price received a formal inquiry from an unnamed party asking about his new client engagement before you'd even signed the paperwork." The basement shrank another degree. They had known about Harlow Price's retainer within 60 minutes of it hitting. That meant my adversaries weren't just sitting on old financial records. They were embedded inside the communication networks of everyone working to keep me out of a federal prison. Banking systems, legal databases, professional networks. They had reach into infrastructure that should have been sealed, monitoring in real time, adjusting their approach as I built mine. I thanked Colonel Dunbar and ended the call, eyes on the dark concrete wall of the basement. Whoever I was up against had resources that ran far beyond Lydia's orbit. This wasn't a vengeful ex-wife cleaning up after herself. This was something larger, more coordinated, and far more dangerous. On Tuesday afternoon, I had my first face-to-face video conference with Harlow Price, where I could actually watch his eyes. And the first thing I noticed was that his crisp, cobalt blue bow tie sat at odds with the gravity of where we actually stood. If they were tracking everyone in my corner, then every strategy session was potentially visible to the other side, which meant the only real path forward was to stop being defensive and start turning their surveillance into a liability. The encrypted video link opened. Harlow materialized from his glass office at Latham and Harwick, wearing that cobalt blue bow tie against a dark suit. "Standard federal defense strategy," Harlow began. "We challenge chain of custody on the digital forensic evidence. We demand an independent examiner. We tie the prosecution in procedural motions for 2 years while methodically pulling their case apart." I let him deliver the whole presentation. Then I leaned toward the camera and said 5 words that made his bow tie actually tilt sideways. "I don't want a defense." Harlow stopped mid-sentence, his pilot vanishing point pen going still above his legal pad. "I want an offensive counterstrike," I continued. "Not a defensive posture. Not a 2-year procedural war. I want a controlled operation that exposes the entire conspiracy while it's still actively hemorrhaging money." The silence ran exactly 7 seconds. "And note," Harlow finally said, setting the pen down with deliberate care, "a controlled operation orchestrated by an active indicted defendant under house arrest is an astronomical legal hazard. AUSA Fenwick will pull your bail before you can blink." "Yeah, then get me a sit-down with Ingrid Fenwick," I said. "I have the entire roadmap." Harlow leaned back and studied me through the camera with the look of a man trying to determine whether his client was a genius or completely unhinged. "Do you know the success rate of a defendant-led sting in a white-collar corruption case?" he asked. "No, neither do I." Harlow said, "Because no one has ever been reckless enough to attempt it while wearing a GPS tracking anklet." I held his gaze. "Then I'll be the first." Harlow tapped his pilot vanishing point pen against his legal pad 3 times. "If we pursue this and it falls apart, there is no recovery," he said slowly. "You move from house arrest to federal detention on the spot. No bail, no appeals. You sit in a cell for 18 months waiting for trial while they stack obstruction charges on top." "Understood." "And if Fenwick says no, then we fall back on your 2-year defense strategy," I said, "but we ask first." Harlow held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "I'll make the call," he said. I cut the video link and settled back into the quiet of the stone basement. There are moments when the only viable road forward is the one laid over live ordnance. I had lived long enough to know those are the only roads that ever go anywhere worth going. Wednesday's late afternoon light hammered the Chicago River into flat gray slate. A sharp autumn wind drove in through my jacket as I stood at the stone railing along the riverwalk. Mick arrived on the dot carrying a dented aluminum travel mug of coffee collar up on a trench coat that had seen better decades. We stood 3 feet apart, without making direct eye contact, both watching the water. "Personally," Mick said after a full minute of silence, "I know you never touched that blood money, Conrad. But federal data logs have no conscience." I shifted slightly and slid the printed Excel transaction ledger into Mick's open trench coat pocket without glancing at him. He drew it out just far enough to skim the first 2 pages, 30 seconds no more. His expression tightened with each line he read, then he buried it deep in his coat. "Who sent you this?" Mick asked. I shook my head. Mick took a slow pull from his travel mug and tracked a kayaker fighting the current below. "If you want Fenwick to greenlight a controlled operation," he said quietly, "you have to be perfect tethered bait. No deviations, no unauthorized contact. She has to own every variable or she shuts the whole thing down before it breathes." "I understand." "Do you?" Mick turned slightly, finally meeting my eyes. Because the moment you step outside the parameters, I'm the one who has to put the handcuffs back on. And next time there won't be any memo recommending your release." I held his look and nodded. Mick and I stood along that waterfront for a long stretch, without speaking, the kind of silence you accumulate after 25 years of holding each other's lines. Then Mick checked his watch and said something that made the autumn wind feel a few degrees colder. "One more thing," he said. "Lydia checked out of the Langham Chicago this morning. She'd been there since the night of your arrest. She moved into a multi-million-dollar penthouse in River North." My jaw went tight. "How much deed shows acquisition price of $8.4 million?" Mick said, "Cash purchase, no mortgage. $8.4 million. While I sat in a basement wearing an ankle monitor, my ex-wife was stepping into luxury real estate that cost more than I'd earned across my entire career." "But here's the interesting part," Mick continued, his voice dropping lower. "The deed isn't in her name. It belongs entirely to Celine." The tugboat's horn echoed across the water, but I barely heard it. "Celine," I repeated. "Your 24-year-old daughter owns an $8.4 million penthouse in River North," Mick said. "Purchased 18 months ago. Lydia's name doesn't appear anywhere in the paperwork." I watched the gray water move past and let that settle. The money trail hadn't gone around my family, it had been engineered from inside it, and not by Lydia. By Celine. My daughter, who I'd last shared a table with at a family dinner 6 months ago. My daughter who had graduated from Wharton 2 years ago. My daughter who apparently held more real estate than most people ever touch in a lifetime. "Mick," I said quietly, "how does a 24-year-old come up with $8.4 million in cash?" "That," Mick said, screwing the cap back onto his travel mug, "is precisely the question Fenwick is going to want answered." He walked away without another word, folding into the autumn dusk. I climbed back up the hill into the wind, the ankle monitor knocking against my leg, with every step turning over the image of a luxury penthouse in River North, registered to my 24-year-old daughter, and recognizing that my family hadn't simply abandoned me. They had built a fortune on top of my grave. On Thursday morning of week 2, I patched into a secure off-the-record terminal at Dirksen Plaza. The moment I looked into Ingrid Fenwick's cold, unblinking eyes, I understood exactly why defense attorneys call her the Iron Wall of the Northern District of Illinois. I'd spent 2 days processing what Celine owning that penthouse meant. My 24-year-old daughter hadn't merely benefited from the conspiracy, she'd designed it, which meant every step forward had to assume she was 3 moves ahead, watching my communications, tracking my legal strategy, waiting for me to slip. The only way to outmaneuver someone that precise was to secure federal cover before she knew it existed. The high-security encrypted video node connected my basement directly to an unmarked conference room on the 8th floor of the federal building. AUSA Ingrid Fenwick sat at the center of the table, 44 years old, short red hair, a sharp black suit that projected professional coldness like a physical force. Harlow Price was at her left. Mick sat to her right. No official recorders, running only handwritten notes. I laid out the complete leverage package over the link. The anonymous transaction logs, the internal hardware keylogger data, Colonel Dunbar's intimidation report, the River North property record, showing an $8.4 million penthouse registered to Celine. Fenwick listened in total silence for 2 full minutes, her face offering nothing. Then she leaned forward, and something in her expression shifted, not sympathy, but recognition. She knew what it looked like when someone had actually built a case. "Judge Breck will sign an emergency authorization for a controlled operation under 18 U.S.C. Section 2516, Fenwick said, her voice carrying the measured weight of federal authority. "From this moment, Mr. Avery, your actions fall within a federal investigative umbrella. Your findings will be admissible." Harlow exhaled audibly into his microphone. However, Fenwick added, her voice dropping half a register as she looked directly into my camera. This operation carries a highly restrictive temporary travel authorization. You move only to specified coordinates within a precise time window under direct FBI surveillance. If you deviate by a single inch, I will personally prosecute you for obstruction of justice. Am I clear? Crystal, I said. Fenwick signed a document off camera and slid it toward Price, who reviewed it at the pace of someone who had run through 100 federal cooperation agreements and wasn't going to be hurried now. Mr. Avery, Fenwick said, you now have legal authority to conduct this investigation. Use it wisely. The screen went dark. Mick's face appeared on a separate encrypted channel 30 seconds later. You have exactly 72 hours, he said quietly, before Celine begins routing the remaining offshore funds beyond reach. Whatever you're going to do, move now. I watched the secure screen fade to black. 72 hours. And I was still blind to half the board I needed to clear. Ezra and I ran data queries for 48 hours without a single break. By 2:00 in the morning on Saturday, Ezra had finished what he called a blockchain forensic sweep, and what I could only describe as a map of my family's damnation. The basement burned with the stark white glow of blockchain ledger rows scrolling across 4 monitors. Ezra sat ringed by empty energy drink cans, his face gray from sleep deprivation, fingers moving across the keyboards with the rhythm of a machine. The funds don't originate from a single defense contractor, Ezra said, highlighting 3 distinct payment streams on the central monitor. They flow from a coordinated network of 3 separate PMCs currently under active classified DOJ investigation. I leaned closer and watched the digital money trail fork and converge like a river delta. Someone is managing the shell infrastructure. Ezra continued surfacing corporate registration documents. Legal architect handling the offshore accounts. His name is Alexei Orlov, elite corporate attorney, operating out of Springfield, Illinois. The name meant nothing to me, but Ezra's expression suggested it should. Orlov specializes in international money laundering for defense contractors, Ezra said. He's been on the FBI's radar for 6 years. They've never been able to touch him, he's too careful. Until now, I said. Ezra gave a slow nod and brought up another document. My gut clenched the moment I read it. The registered mailing address for one of Orlov's core shell entities was the same River North penthouse where Lydia was living right now. I sat there staring at the screen, Mick's Wednesday warning replaying in my head. This wasn't money moving through my family like water through a pipe. It was embedded there, built into the very property they slept under. I had to ask the question I didn't want answered. How far back does this go? Ezra navigated to Celine's international travel history data he'd pulled from airline systems through channels I understood better than to inquire about. He swept a finger across the highlighted rows. 18 months, 7 separate flights to Zurich. Round trips, every one of them, never more than 48 hours on the ground. She traveled without a companion each time. No joint itineraries, no corporate authorizations on file. 7 Zurich runs in a year and a half. I let that number sit while I reconstructed my DoD calendar from memory. The classified logistics contracts I'd reviewed and signed off on, the multi-billion-dollar procurement decisions I'd shepherded through the approval chain. Then I laid Celine's departure dates against that internal timeline one by one. The pattern was exact and merciless. Each of those 7 flights had lifted off within 48 hours of DoD finalizing its biggest classified logistics awards. Not a rough correlation. Not a few matching entries. Every last one aligned. She was reading my schedule in real time, I said, my voice coming out barely louder than a breath. The approvals hadn't even been formally published before she was wheels up. Ezra's face had gone tight and still. "That's beyond simple money movement," he said. She was running both levers simultaneously, domestic approvals on one end, offshore transfers on the other. The whole operation coordinated from the inside. 7 glowing date entries on the monitor, each one representing a window into classified government business that should have been impenetrable. My own career had functioned as her private early warning system, and not once had I seen it coming. Saturday morning found me in the basement, a military-grade audio receiver clamped over my ears, patched into the conversation Harlow Price was having with the most exposed player in the whole apparatus, a DCMA contracting officer named Rupert Gentry, the man Ezra's forensic accounting had already cracked open. Tracing exactly how Celine had accessed my scheduling information would take more than reading blockchain ledgers. It meant following the human chain, the people she'd bought, the ones who'd opened doors they were never supposed to touch. Rupert Gentry had taken exactly $180,000 dispersed in amounts that tracked almost perfectly against his daughter's out-of-state university bills. The meeting had been arranged at an anonymous coffee shop on a Rosemont commercial block, chosen because it sat far enough from DOD to avoid any familiar faces, yet close enough that Gentry could slip out during his lunch hour and be back at his desk before anyone noticed. Gentry, 55 heavyset, was wedged into the corner booth farthest from the doorcap, brim pulled low, both hands clamped around a coffee cup he hadn't once lifted to his mouth. I had no visual, but Ezra had embedded a receiver in Harlow's tie clip, and the audio was immaculate. "Mr. Gentry." Harlow opened his voice, holding that studied, bloodless evenness that lawyers deploy when the sentence has already been written. "An anonymous delivery arrived at your address yesterday, financial documents. I act on behalf of the person who sent them." Silence stretched between them. The cup scraped against the saucer. Then, "I didn't know." Gentry's voice was barely holding together. "I give you my word, I had no idea what those containers were carrying." "Walk me through it," Harlow said, quiet and unhurried. And through the receiver, I heard the man come apart. "Celine came to me 2 years back," he said. "Composed, completely professional. She laid out a payment structure, $180,000 broken across 6 installments, in exchange for my authorized signature on 14 shipping manifests. The paperwork described humanitarian medical supplies bound for PMC shell entities." I pressed my eyes shut, each sentence landing like a stone. The actual contents of those containers, I never knew they were restricted military components. His voice disintegrated further. "My daughter's enrolled at Lincoln Park, the fees I was underwater. Celine found that out somehow. She knew the exact number that would get me to sign." Harlow gave him room to finish, then slid a document across the table. "Federal proffer agreement," he said. "Full cooperation with the government, and AUSA Fenwick has committed to recommending substantial leniency. Decline to sign, and everything in that package reaches the FBI field office before close of business today." Gentry didn't hesitate. "I'll sign it, whatever it takes." The feed went dead the moment Harlow closed the meeting. 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed. "He'll give them everything they need," Harlow said. "But before you move another step, there's something you have to hear." "Tell me." It wasn't Celine who first made contact with Gentry, Harlow said, choosing each word with care. "It was Lydia. 2 full years before Celine walked across the Wharton stage. The cold that moved through my chest was different from anything I'd felt before. Lydia had been the one to recruit. The contractor had brought him inside the operation before our daughter was ever on the scene. I sat in that dim basement running the implications through my head, and with every pass the picture turned darker. Sunday, 4 in the afternoon. I pushed through the entrance of a private law library in the Loop that reeked of crumbling leather bindings and old, damp wood. The light that came through the stained glass was pale and slanted, breaking into muted colors across shelves of leather-spined legal volumes no one had consulted in years. Celine was already at the center table, a vast expanse of dark oak dressed in a spotless charcoal suit, hair drawn back without a strand out of place. She could have been arriving for an analyst briefing. Instead, she was sitting across from her father in a room where every syllable was potential evidence. The meeting was my idea, arranged through Price's office, Gentry's confession, and Lydia's fingerprints on the early architecture. I was done processing those things through screens and encrypted files. I needed her in front of me. I needed to watch her face. "Hello, Dad." Her register was flat, completely flat. I took the chair across from her and studied her expression for anything a flicker a tell. Nothing. "Rupert Gentry executed a federal proffer agreement yesterday," I said. She didn't move. "So I forged your cryptographic digital signature on 23 internal DoD compliance reviews." She spoke like she was reading a grocery list. "Each review certified the PMC shell entities as legitimate financial actors. Your standing as senior financial inspector meant those certifications were never questioned. Washington didn't double-check work that came with your name on it." A slight backward shift in her chair posture, perfectly arranged. 30 years of building a reputation no one would challenge, Dad. The pause was deliberate. I used what was available to me. Something in my chest gave way, something I hadn't realized was still holding. "Did you ever stop to think about what was actually inside those manifests?" She met my eyes. Hers were empty in a way I couldn't account for. No answer came. She got to her feet, smoothed her lapels with the brisk, automatic precision I remembered from her high school debate prep, and moved toward the door. "Your attorney has 48 hours to sign the non-disclosure agreement and accept the settlement terms," she said, moving without hurry. At the threshold, she turned just slightly. "And don't go to Lydia looking for shelter," she said, her voice dropping a register. "She won't protect you, Dad. She never has." The heavy door closed behind her with a definitive click. I didn't move for a long time. Her words about Lydia bounced off the stone and came back to me from every direction. "She won't protect you." The daughter who had gutted my life was cautioning me against the wife who had walked away from it. Why Monday arrived with a headache I couldn't shake, and I was back at the monitors before the sun came up, tracing the origins of Apex Meridian Capital, trying to make sense of what Celine had dropped in that room. "She won't protect you. She never has." I kept turning it over in the dark, the basement silent around me, an untouched mug going cold at my elbow. Celine had said it the way you state something everyone already knows, which told me the hierarchy inside my family was nothing like I'd mapped it. Ezra had been at it through the night, reconstructing the company's genealogy from incorporation filings, shareholder records, and wire authorization documents, charting the precise moment Lydia's rough, improvised fraud gave way to Celine's engineered international structure. Lydia set up Apex Meridian Capital as a generic import shell 6 months before Celine finished at Wharton. Ezra said, walking me through the filings on screen. Crude from the start, shell names that practically announced themselves offshore routing that any halfway attentive auditor would have flagged. The architecture of someone feeling her way in the dark. I studied the documents carefully. Then Ezra pulled up a second layer of records. 3 months after Celine collected her diploma, he said everything changed. The whole corporate skeleton was torn down and rebuilt. What replaced it bore no resemblance to the original tiered offshore subsidiaries, genuine operating fronts, routing structures, sophisticated enough to pass scrutiny from federal bank examiners. Lydia didn't have the mind for what came next. I said almost to myself. No, Ezra said. Selene didn't step into her mother's operation. She dismantled it and built a weapon. I watched the screen as the full architecture resolved itself. Selene had converted Apex Meridian Capital into a financial fortress, while taking care to leave Lydia as the sole name on every legal document. Corporate filings, banking authorizations, every registration, Lydia's signature appeared on all of it, positioning her as the obvious target the moment federal investigators came looking, which they now had. And Lydia had retreated into a River North penthouse that Selene controlled. There's something else, Ezra said, surfacing a hidden ledger entry buried 7 layers down in the offshore architecture. A 7th shell company. The account is registered under the name Callum Avery. My pulse jumped. Lydia's estranged son from her first marriage, I said. Callum Avery. Lydia's boy from a previous husband, someone who hadn't exchanged a word with his mother in 5 years and was living completely off the grid in Wicker Park. His name was attached to an offshore routing account holding $4.7 million. And I knew immediately he had no idea the money existed. Tuesday afternoon. Harlow showed up at Callum's cramped Wicker Park studio while I monitored the exchange from the basement through a hidden mobile audio transmitter. Callum Avery, 28 years old, answered the door in gym shorts and a faded t-shirt, hair disheveled like someone who had just surfaced from sleep at 2:00 in the afternoon. Callum Avery, Harlow asked. Yeah. I'm Harlow Price, federal defense attorney. I need to show you something. Through the receiver, I picked up the rustle of documents as Harlow laid out official bank records detailing the offshore account. A long silence followed, then the sharp crack of something ceramic hitting hardwood. Callum had dropped his coffee mug. What the hell is this? His voice broke between confusion and rising panic. That's $4.7 million moved through an offshore account registered under your Social Security number. Harlow said, steady as stone. Over the past 18 months. I closed that account 2 years ago, Callum said. I don't have $4 million. I work at a coffee shop. It was never actually closed, Harlow explained. Selena intercepted the closure notice, forged your authorization, and used your stolen identity to build a secondary tier of offshore accounts for international money laundering. Through the receiver, I heard Callum drop onto what sounded like a worn sofa, his breathing gone shallow. This is identity theft, he said, voice barely holding. My own sister stole my name to move blood money. Yes, Harlow said. And that positions you as a primary material witness for the United States government. A long pause. Does my mother know? Callum asked. And I could hear exactly what lived underneath those words, the fragile hope that his estranged mother had not been part of his sister taking his identity. Harlow's silence was its own answer. Callum arrived there without being told. She knew, he said, flat and hollow. Lydia knew Selene was using my name. We can't establish that definitively, Harlow said with care. But the corporate structure indicates she had visibility into those accounts. Listening to Callum say the words my own sister pulled me straight back to the law library and Selene's immaculate charcoal suit. She hadn't merely come after her father. She had used her brother's identity like a disposable instrument. I'll testify, Callum said, his voice hardening. Whatever you need, I'll testify against both of them. Both, Harlow asked. In Selene and Lydia, Callum said. My sister and my mother. They can both rot in federal prison for all I care. I sat in the basement listening to a 28-year-old whose family had deployed him as a financial prop. Something shifted in my chest, a cold fury that no longer had anything to do with my own ruin. Celine hadn't just engineered this conspiracy. She'd cut through everyone around her with surgical efficiency. Her father, her brother. And from what Ezra's corporate archaeology had revealed, she'd arranged her own mother as the designated fall figure if the structure ever came apart. The question that remained was whether Lydia understood she was the intended scapegoat, or whether she still believed she was steering an enterprise her daughter had long since taken from her. I killed the audio feed and turned to Ezra. "It's time to find out where Lydia's loyalties actually sit," I said, "and we're going to use something she can't walk away from." By Wednesday afternoon, with Callum's testimony secured and the federal trap in place, I was ready to put the first piece of bait in the water. The bait was greed layered over fear, delivered through a forensic PDF engineered to reveal exactly where Lydia stood. Ezra stood behind my chair in the basement, watching live data packets move across a network map, the room taut and underscored by the hum of the server array. At my direction, Harlow Price sent an email to Lydia's personal legal counsel with the subject line, "Confidential, unredacted, marital settlement proposal." Embedded inside the document was a fully legal forensic tracking pixel standard corporate security practice that recorded access times, IP addresses, device signatures, and geolocations. No malicious code, just metadata. The text of the document carried my calculated bluff. I claimed to hold the master cryptographic private keys to a $50 million PMC wallet that Celine was urgently trying to liquidate, and I demanded a 50% split in return for permanent silence. The objective was straightforward: trip Lydia's raw financial survival instinct and see which way she moved. Ezra tracked incoming server traffic in real-time, eyes fixed on the network map. "Lydia's River North IP just opened the file," he said. 3:47 p.m. I leaned in, watching the data stream. "She closed it," Ezra continued. "Reopened 11 minutes later. Third access at 4:23 held it open for 22 consecutive minutes." "She's running the numbers," I said. "Exactly." When my burner phone rang at precisely 11:00 that night, Lydia's voice came through, shaking and hushed, as though someone was just outside her bedroom door, and I knew exactly who she was trying not to wake. The trap had closed. Now I had to survive what came back at me. "Conrad," Lydia whispered. "We need to meet. Alone." Thursday morning, before I'd touched my first coffee, Mick reached my secure line with a tone that was clipped and carrying an edge I recognized. "Orlov failed to appear at his Springfield corporate office." Mick said, no preamble. "An abandoned rental car turned up an hour ago in O'Hare long-term parking. Federal manifests show he checked in for a commercial flight to London Heathrow, but never boarded. He's in the wind." My jaw clenched. "And the Illinois accounts were completely drained 18 hours before we could execute the asset freeze warrants," Mick said. "Someone gave him the signal. Who inside our circle knew we were mapping Orlov?" "Fenwick Price, you, me, and Ezra," Mick said, grim. "And whoever had eyes on Lydia's terminal." Ezra pulled up the metadata from Lydia's PDF access. Within 3 hours of her opening the file from the River North IP, Orlov had begun his exit sequence. Celine had spotted her mother's digital footprint and cleared the board. "This isn't a setback," I told Mick, my eyes narrowing. "It means Lydia is frightened. She knows her daughter is tying off loose ends, and that will make her move faster." Before he hung up, Mick offered a detail that made sleep an impossibility. "We pulled a secondary booking under a false passport on that same Zurich flight Orlov skipped," he said quietly. "The photo on the alias, I didn't know the name, but I knew the face. It was Lydia." Friday afternoon, I entered room 1204 of a plain business hotel in the Loop. flanked by undercover federal agents who took up position in the corridor outside. The room was featureless and sterile, cheap fabric sofa, generic wall art, the flat chemical odor of industrial cleaner. Lydia sat at the edge of the sofa in a simple gray knit sweater, every trace of her signature Armani charcoal gray, with ivory trim conspicuously absent. She looked a decade older than the last time I'd seen her. Not a single piece of jewelry. She was moving toward a deal before I had fully settled into my seat. "I'll hand over the complete unencrypted server backups of Vanguard Apex," she said, hands unsteady. "I'll testify directly against Celine in exchange for full federal immunity and a preserved share of the remaining funds." Her voice broke at the edges. "Celine will hand me to the grand jury the instant the pressure lands," she continued. "I know her. I built the foundation, Conrad, but she turned it into something I no longer have any hand in." I looked at the woman I had shared 20 years of my life with. "Lydia," I said quietly and with something close to genuine pity. "Celine has already cleared the Illinois accounts. The entire corporate structure was built to ensure you absorb the consequences while she walks away untouched." Lydia stared at her hands, the reality settling over her. She was not the architect of this enterprise. She was its designated shield. I gave a slow nod, letting her believe I was agreeing to her terms. But before I'd stepped into that room, I had done something the honorable man she once married would never have done. I had dialed Celine's personal cell and left my phone live in my breast pocket, an open audio call running throughout. One-party consent, entirely legal. Celine heard every word of her mother's betrayal as it unfolded in real time. I kept the line open until Lydia finished her final confession, then rose from the sofa and walked toward the door. "I'll have Harlow draw up the paperwork," I said. Lydia nodded, relief washing across her face. I stepped out into the carpeted hotel corridor and checked my display. Celine had disconnected 4 minutes earlier, right after her mother had offered to hand a federal traitor to the FBI. 2 minutes later, a text landed from her number. "Family meeting, Lake Geneva Estate, Sunday, 4:00 p.m. Both of you be there." I stood in that corridor, staring at those words, feeling the full weight of what I'd set in motion. Lydia believed she'd secured her exit. She thought she'd finally gotten a step ahead of her daughter. But Celine had heard every word, and now she was pulling us both to the Lake Geneva estate, not for any kind of resolution, but for a reckoning. She intended to strike before we could file. 24 hours before the Lake Geneva confrontation, I came downstairs to find Ezra sitting in the darkened basement with 7 wallet addresses burning on his monitor. $83 million mapped to the last decimal. Every cryptographic coordinate confirmed and locked. Saturday had come. Celine's summons hung in my mind like a blade suspended above my neck. But before I walked into her trap, I needed to confirm our counter-trap was set. Ezra had worked through the night running an exhaustive blockchain sweep that accounted for every digital asset Celine controlled. 7 primary Vanguard Apex cold wallets, Ezra said, without lifting his eyes from the screen, spread across 4 international jurisdictions. Cayman Islands, Singapore, Switzerland, Monaco. I leaned over his shoulder and watched the figures resolve across the display. Total value $83 million in digital assets. "The entire infrastructure is deliberately redundant," Ezra said. "Multiple jurisdictions, multiple banking systems, multiple regulatory frameworks. This wasn't engineered for efficiency. It was engineered for flight." That was the line that turned my blood cold. Celine and her co-conspirators, Alexei Orlov, Lydia, and others I hadn't yet named, had built this network with escape already factored in. The redundancy wasn't anxiety. It was a funded exit strategy. "The data package is secured and formatted for DOJ presentation." Ezra continued surfacing the encrypted folder. Everything Fenwick needs to execute the asset frees the moment Celine makes her move. I went through the final documentation and confirmed the technical case was airtight. For the first time in 3 weeks, something approaching professional satisfaction settled over me. The foundation was solid. Now it came down to execution. That afternoon, I drove to Lakeside Memory Care in Evanston, possibly the last time I'd see my mother before everything either held together or came apart in a federal courtroom. Irene sat in her wingback chair by the window in room 114, autumn light, flooding through and gilding everything amber Jeopardy playing on the television. She didn't know my face when I came through the door, but the moment I sat beside her and took her weathered hand, she wrapped her fingers around mine without hesitation. "How you look like a man about to board a very long flight," she said, studying me with eyes that were somehow both empty and sharp at once. Something in my chest gave way. "Just a day trip, Mom," I said quietly. She gave a small nod and returned her gaze to the screen, but her hand never let go. We sat together for 3 hours. I didn't say much. She didn't ask questions. We watched game shows while the afternoon light dissolved into dusk, her hand warm and steady in mine. And sitting there in that amber quiet, I understood this was it. Not the mansion, not the operation. This was what I had been protecting all along. Before I left, I bent down and kissed her forehead. She looked up at me with complete lucidity for exactly 3 seconds. "I'm proud of you, Connie," she whispered. Then the clarity was gone and she turned back to the television. I walked out of room 114 and didn't turn around. In my rearview mirror, I watched her window light shrink as I pulled away. Whatever the next day brought, I had made my peace with what mattered. Mick called my secure line at 8:00 that evening. "Judge Breck signed the order," he said, no preamble. "Emergency asset freeze pre-approved and ready to trigger. One condition: Celine attempting extortion in front of a federal witness." "Who's the witness?" I asked. "Placement is being finalized," Mick said carefully. "But the legal infrastructure is in position. One move, one clean recording, and it's over." I thought about Celine's text. The estate. 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. "I'll be there," I said. 4:00 p.m. "Conrad," Mick said, his voice dropping. "This is the end game. Whatever happens tomorrow, there's no walking it back." "I know." I ended the call and sat in the basement, silence, feeling 3 weeks of preparation converging on a single afternoon. Then my phone chimed with an incoming email. Anonymous sender, encrypted, routing a single line of text. "Your mother's facility accepts wire transfers from overseas. Thought you should know. A friend." Ice flooded through me. Ezra had the metadata up within seconds. "Sender's IP traces to a Cayman Islands timestamp," he said quietly. "Matches one of Celine's wallet locations." I sat looking at that message with complete understanding of what it meant. Selena knew which facility my mother was in, and she was making sure I knew she could reach Irene whenever she chose. The email sat in my inbox like a live charge. I called the facility's night administrator immediately. No unusual wire transfers, no contact from anyone claiming to be family, no security concerns flagged. I forwarded the email to Mick with 3 words. "Does this change?" Sunday, his reply came back in 90 seconds. "No. It makes it necessary." I looked at my mother's contact photo. Irene smiling in a picture taken 5 years ago before Alzheimer's had dismantled most of what she carried. Then I looked at the Lake Geneva address in Celine's text. 21 hours until we walked through that door. Celine had moved from financial warfare to something more personal. She had shown me she was prepared to use the one person in my life who was entirely innocent, entirely without defense. Which meant tomorrow's meeting had nothing to do with money or legal strategy anymore. It was about stopping a person willing to weaponize an 84-year-old woman with Alzheimer's to win a chess match. I sat in the dark basement and felt my fear condense into something colder and harder than fear. Tomorrow, one way or the other, this was finished. At 10:47 p.m. Saturday night, 4 encrypted video feeds blinked to life in the Lincoln Park basement. Mick Beaumont's face filled the main screen, flanked by Harlow Price's tactical overlay, and a third window showing a woman I'd never encountered, who would determine whether I walked out of this or spent the next decade inside the Metropolitan Detention Center. Celine's threat against my mother had changed tomorrow's meeting from a legal trap into something far more urgent. If she was willing to deploy an 84-year-old woman with Alzheimer's as leverage, there were no lines she wouldn't cross, which meant our operation had to be flawless. Final tactical briefing. Mick said, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of federal prosecutions. Everyone on this call operates under absolute security protocol. No recordings outside federal servers. Ezra sat beside me, monitoring network traffic, confirming our encrypted channels were clean. The third window showed a woman in her late 30s, sharp features, dark hair, drawn back in a severe bun gray suit that said corporate litigator without a syllable spoken. "This is Special Agent Petra Halsey," Mick said. "She's been backstopped as Fenwick and Avery's corporate compliance specialist. Celine requested additional legal representation for tomorrow's meeting. We gave her exactly what she asked for." Something close to satisfaction moved through me as I watched the pieces lock into position. Celine had unknowingly invited a federal witness into her own extortion. "Agent Halsey will be at the Lake Geneva estate tomorrow at 4:00 p.m. Mick continued. "She'll be introduced as part of your legal team, Conrad. Celine won't suspect federal involvement. The backstop is airtight. Real bar admission, genuine employment history, with Fenwick's firm verifiable corporate compliance credentials." Halsey moved toward her camera. "I need clean audio," she said, her voice flat and precise. "One unambiguous extortion statement on the record. If Celine detects federal involvement, the whole operation comes apart." "Understood," I said. Mick's expression went hard. "If the trigger fails, Conrad, the original indictment still stands," he said. "No second attempt. If Celine smells Halsey or introduces new forged evidence before she makes her move, the asset freeze doesn't execute and you stay the primary target." Harlow's face appeared in the second window. "The legal exposure here is substantial," he said. "We're staking everything on Celine being confident enough to commit federal extortion in front of what she believes is your corporate attorney." "She will be," I said with more certainty than I actually felt. Halsey's feed went dark at 11:15 p.m., leaving only an empty window where my fate had just been entrusted to a federal agent I'd known for 11 minutes. Mick and Harlow signed off shortly after, leaving Ezra and me alone in the basement with tomorrow bearing down like something physical. Then Ezra turned from his monitor. There was something else, a metadata analysis he'd been running in the background. "The anonymous email about your mother, I traced the IP origin." I turned to look at him. "Where?" "Stuart Wharton Building Terminal," Ezra said, flagging a timestamp. 4 years ago, the same day as Celine's graduation ceremony." My pulse jumped. Someone transmitted from a Wharton terminal on Celine's graduation day. "Not the threat," Ezra clarified. "The original Excel spreadsheet, the transaction logs that started this whole investigation. That file was sent from a Wharton terminal 4 years ago." He brought up another document. The spreadsheet metadata carries the original author's signature, R. Gentry, CMA. Rupert compiled those logs as insurance and stored them on a USB drive in his home desk. "But Rupert didn't send them to me," I said. "No," Ezra agreed. Someone physically removed that USB from Rupert's desk and transmitted the files. Someone with access to his home who knew where he kept his insurance policy and who decided you needed to see it. Ezra surfaced a final document that snapped everything into alignment. Rupert Gentry has a daughter, he said. Zara Gentry. She was Celine's classmate at Wharton, graduated the same day. I sat staring at the screen, working through what that meant. Rupert Gentry, the most compromised man I'd ever encountered, had raised a daughter willing to turn on her father's co-conspirators. Zara pulled that USB knowing exactly what it would cost her family, Ezra said. She wanted you to have the ammunition. She's been in your corner from the start. I leaned back in my chair, recalibrating everything I thought I knew about the anonymous source. Not a guilt-driven whistleblower, a young woman who had watched her father get bought and decided to dismantle the conspiracy from within. My phone buzzed at 11:38 p.m. Secure text blocked number. Avery Celine knows you met Gentry. She's altering Lake Geneva layout. Be careful. I read it aloud. Ezra pulled up our communication logs and checked timestamps immediately. That text arrived 90 seconds after we identified Zara, he said, voice tight. Either a remarkable coincidence or someone has been inside our systems all along. I looked from the blocked number to Ezra. Run a full packet analysis, I said. Check for intrusion, check everything. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling network logs, reviewing firewall records, combing through data packets. The basement filled with the clatter of rapid keystrokes and the low hum of servers under strain. No unauthorized access I can find, Ezra said after 10 minutes. But that only means they're skilled enough to stay invisible, not that they're not in here. Who else was watching this game and how long had they been playing? I stared at the warning on my phone. Someone had learned about our Gentry meeting before we could report it. Someone had known we'd just identified Zara. Someone was tracking both sides of this war in real time and feeding me intelligence I couldn't live without. But I had no idea who they were or what they expected in return. The blocked number text sat on my screen, stamped 90 seconds after we'd named Zara Gentry. Ezra ran packet analysis hunting for intrusion, while I read and reread the words, she's altering Lake Geneva layout. Whoever sent that warning had known about our Gentry meeting before Rupert's ink was dry, which meant someone had been monitoring both sides of this conflict from the beginning. And we were walking into tomorrow's confrontation half-blind. I turned to Ezra. We go anyway, I said. 4:00 p.m. as planned. Even without knowing who else is at the table, Ezra asked. Especially because we don't know, I said. Whoever's running the parallel game just warned us Celine is changing the layout. That means they want us to succeed, or they want us believing they do. Or both, Ezra said quietly. I didn't have an answer for that. At 5:00 in the morning, I was still in the basement, cold coffee at my elbow, a 25-character text I'd read 10 times burning deeper with each pass. She's altering Lake Geneva layout. The anonymous warning sat on my phone like a device with an unknown fuse. Someone was observing both sides of this war, passing me intelligence I couldn't corroborate. But Sunday had arrived, and in 11 hours I'd be walking through Celine's door, either as the bait in a successful federal trap, or as a man about to be dismantled by his own daughter. I forwarded the text to Mick's secure line and waited. He rang back in under 2 minutes. Prepaid SIM. Mick said no greeting. Deactivated 60 seconds after transmission. Burner phone bought for cash at a Pilsen corner store 3 weeks ago. No surveillance footage, no card trail, nothing. Professional, I said. Very haw, Mick agreed. Who knew about the Gentry extraction besides us? I thought through the operational perimeter. Fenwick Price, Mick Ezra, me, and whoever Celine had watching Rupert Gentry. If she knows Gentry's flipped, she's been backed into a corner, I said. She'll move fast to force my signature before his testimony becomes usable. The plan holds. Or we pull back, Mick said. Regroup, wait for cleaner intelligence before we move. No, I said firmly. A cornered Celine is precisely the threat we need to spring the asset freeze. Desperation makes people overreach. Mick went quiet for a moment. There's something else, he said. The sender had Ezra's secure burner number. That detail doesn't exist in any database, any file, any traceable system. Whoever sent that warning is sitting right at this table, Conrad. Someone close enough to know operational specifics is actively working to keep you alive. Ice moved down my spine. Zara, I said. Maybe Mick said. Or someone we haven't accounted for. I stared at the text, trying to map angles I couldn't see. The plan holds, I said. A cornered Celine overplays her hand. That's our trigger. Harlow Price called at 8:00 sharp, his voice controlled but carrying an edge. Callum broke down overnight, Harlow said. He'd been going through his compromised digital history the way you suggested, and he turned something up. What? An automated banking notification, routing to an unlisted encrypted address he never authorized. Harlow said, Proton Mail account, B-Cross, real estate, protonmail.com. Banking authorizations, property filings, corporate documents, all routing through an account Callum swears he never created. I put Harlow on speaker so Ezra could follow. Can you trace the account creation? I asked Ezra. His fingers were already moving. Give me 30 seconds, he said. The basement filled again with the sound of rapid typing servers pulling metadata from encrypted records that shouldn't have been reachable. Then Ezra's voice cut through. The IP is River North Lydia's penthouse. Something cold and precise settled in my chest. Celine built a fraudulent digital identity for her brother. I said slowly from their own mother's address. Account creation timestamp is 14 months ago, Ezra continued running through the logs. Multiple logins originating from the same River North address. She constructed this fraud from Lydia's living room. Harlow's voice came back through the speaker. Callum wants this on the record, he said. He asked me to tell you he'll testify against both of them, against Celine and against Lydia. He's done running. I looked at Ezra and saw my own grim resolution mirrored in his face. Celine had committed aggravated federal identity theft against her own brother, operating from their mother's internet connection. The evidence path ran straight to the penthouse Lydia occupied, paid for with funds stolen through Callum's fraudulent accounts. The irony had a certain dark symmetry. Get Callum into protective custody now, I said, before Celine realizes he's turned. Already coordinating with Mick, Harlow said. FBI's moving him to a safe house within the hour. I called Mick back immediately. Callum Avery is willing to testify, I said. Identity theft, fraudulent accounts, all of it. Aggravated federal identity theft under 18 U.S.C. Section 1028, Mick said, and I could hear him pulling up the statute. 2-year mandatory minimum consecutive to any other sentence. If we land Selene on RICO and identity theft, she's looking at a decade at minimum, even with some charges failing to hold. Callum Avery, the brother Celine had written off as weak and expendable, had just handed us the nail for her coffin. Harlow's coordinating the safe house, I said. Already moving, Mick confirmed. Callum will be secured by 9:00 a.m. And Conrad, he asked Harlow to tell you he's sorry it took this long. Something I hadn't expected moved through me genuine sympathy for a 28-year-old whose family had used him as a financial instrument, without his knowledge or consent. At 8:22 a.m., Harlow sent a confirmation text. Callum en route safe. I checked my watch. 7 hours and 38 minutes until we walked through the Lake Geneva estate doors. Mick's final text arrived as I reached for coffee that had gone cold again. Halsey is in position. Cellini just confirmed all 3 attorneys for Fort's owner Pill. PM. She has no idea one of them carries a badge. I read that message 3 times as the pieces settled into their final positions. The trap was armed. Callum's testimony secured. Rupert Gentry's proffer signed. The blockchain evidence locked. Petra Halsey embedded as Selina's requested corporate attorney, carrying a federal wire that would capture every word. And somewhere out there, someone with access to Ezra's secure burner number was watching every move we made, passing warnings, keeping us operational for reasons I still couldn't calculate. I looked at Ezra across the basement. 7.5 hours, I said. He gave a single nod and was already pulling together the equipment we'd need for the final confrontation. Whatever happened at that Lake Geneva estate this afternoon, there would be no undoing it. No second chances, no escape routes. Just one federal witness, one wire recording, and one daughter who believed she'd constructed a trap her father couldn't walk out of. She was about to discover that the man who taught her to read financial ledgers had also taught her everything she knew about setting traps. But not everything he knew. The unmarked black vehicle rolled up to the Lincoln Park curb at exactly 100 p.m., and I stepped out of the townhouse carrying nothing but a manila folder, a federal tracking bracket, and the weight of a 22-year marriage ending in controlled detonation. Mick stood beside the driver's door, aviator sunglasses catching the October sky. Ezra's already in back, he said, pulling open the rear passenger door. We need to talk before you settle in. I slid into the leather seat. Ezra sat across from me, laptop open, noise-canceling headphones hanging around his neck. The partition behind the driver was sealed soundproof. Lydia booked a flight, Mick said. Swiss International Air 127 Dulles to Zurich. Departs tomorrow morning at 7:22 a.m. The words hit me like something physical. Under what name? Margaret Beckett, British passport. Very good forgery, probably cost her $50,000. Mick pulled out his phone and showed me a surveillance photo. Lydia at a FedEx office in Arlington stepping out with a padded envelope. Timestamp. Friday, 3:47 p.m. She collected those documents 2 hours after your bail hearing. She's running, I said quietly. She's had an exit plan from the moment she understood you might survive this. Mick pocketed his phone. The question is what she takes with her that we still need for prosecution. Ezra spoke without glancing up. She withdrew $200,000 from a Credit Suisse account Thursday. Cash. That purchases considerable silence in Switzerland. The vehicle merged onto I-95 North. Through tinted glass, I watched the Chicago River slip past. 22 years ago, Lydia and I had driven this same corridor on our way to see the Lake Geneva estate for the first time. How long until we get there, I asked. 2 hours, 40 minutes, Mick said. We'll have you positioned in the study at 3:45 p.m., 15 minutes ahead of the meeting. My phone buzzed. Ezra, his face suddenly sharpened with urgency. Conrad, you need to see this. He angled his laptop toward me. On screen, a live feed of account activity transactions scrolling in real time. Cellini just initiated wire transfers across 6 separate accounts, $12 million moving toward offshore shells, Cayman, Singapore, Hong Kong. Mick leaned in. Started 4 minutes ago. She's liquidating fast. Ezra's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. These are accounts we've been watching, but haven't touched yet. We needed to let the money flow map where the network terminated. She knows, I said. The realization settled cold and flat in my chest. Someone tipped her. Mick's jaw set. Or she's sharp enough to read the signals herself. Callum goes silent. You're suddenly cooperative, the meeting gets pushed to today. She's cutting her losses. Ezra shook his head. This isn't defensive. This is scorched earth. She's taking everything she can move before the ceiling collapses. The vehicle accelerated past slower traffic. I thought about Celine somewhere in Chicago at her computer, methodically dismantling the financial architecture she'd assembled over 5 years. Methodical. Ruthless. Can you stop the transfers, I asked? Ezra grimaced, not without showing our hand. The moment we touch those accounts, she knows federal authorities are in the room. She'll warn Lydia, warn the others. The whole operation unravels. Mick checked his watch. How much time do we have? Depends on how many accounts she's prepared to drain. If she's moving everything, Ezra calculated quietly. Maybe 90 minutes before it's all gone. We drove without speaking for 20 minutes. I watched mile markers go by each one, drawing me closer to the estate, closer to the confrontation that would either restore my name or finish what remained of my life. Mick made 2 phone calls and clipped federal shorthand. Ezra tracked his screens, occasionally murmuring dollar figures. At 2:56 p.m., Ezra swore under his breath. Another 4 million. That's 16 total. She's not slowing down. Mick leaned across to look at the screen. Where's it landing? Shell company in Singapore. Same corporate architecture as the others, almost certainly established years ago as an emergency valve. Ezra traced a transaction chain. This one passes through 3 intermediaries before it reaches the destination account. Sophisticated, carefully layered. She learned from the best, I said bitterly. Lydia's been her teacher since she was 23. The vehicle passed a green highway sign. Walworth County, 12 miles. We were 40 miles out from the estate now, less than an hour away. Through the windshield, the afternoon sun had broken through the overcast, throwing long shadows across the road ahead. Ezra's phone buzzed. He answered, listened, his expression going darker. "You understood. Keep tracking." He hung up and looked at me. "Harlow just confirmed another 5 million moved. That's 21 total." "Jesus," Mick breathed. "She's good," Ezra said simply. "Better than I'd estimated." The vehicle crossed into Walworth County at 3:17 p.m. The landscape opened up, wider parcels, older trees, the quiet, manicured wealth of the Lake Geneva lakefront. I recognized the territory. A country club where I'd played golf with business partners, a restaurant where Lydia and I had marked our 10th anniversary. Mick's phone rang. He answered, listened for 30 seconds, then said, "Copy that, we're 43 minutes out." He ended the call and turned to me. "Petra Halsey is positioned inside the estate. She arrived as Celine's attorney 20 minutes ago. Lydia personally greeted her at the door." "Does Lydia suspect anything?" I asked. Mick's smile was cold. "According to Halsey, your wife just offered her champagne and asked whether she'd ever been to Switzerland." Ezra shut his laptop with a decisive snap. $21 million gone, a wife with a flight booked in 16 hours, and a daughter systematically erasing every trace of what she built. "Conrad, I hope to God your federal immunity holds, because we're about to walk into a viper's nest." I looked out at the passing estates, their iron gates and circular drives, their carefully maintained facades of American prosperity. In 43, I would pass through those same gates into my own home, wearing a wire backed by federal agents facing the family I had spent my life constructing. Mick's phone buzzed with a text. He read it and turned the screen toward me. "Target preparing for 4:00 p.m. meeting. All 3 attorneys present. Subject appears calm." I held on that one word. Calm. Lydia was always calm. Even now, with her escape flight confirmed and her daughter burning through millions, she would smile and pour champagne and hold the room like a gracious hostess. It was the same composure she'd worn the afternoon she slid me the power of attorney 5 years ago, certain I would sign without question, which I did, never imagining she was already engineering my ruin. The engine cut at exactly 3:45 p.m., outside iron gates old enough to have watched a different century arrive. Through the bare October oaks, warm light poured from French windows where my daughter sat waiting to finish me. Mick pressed his radio earpiece, listening. Agent Halsey is in position in the library. Been there 30 minutes under the corporate legal backstop. Selene, seated her at the table herself, doesn't suspect a thing. I stared at the estate through tinted glass. 22 years of fundraisers and holiday dinners of watching Selene and Callum run through those gardens. Now it was nothing more than a stage for my family's final act. Room layout, Mick said, displaying a floor plan on his phone. Celine's at the head with 2 senior attorneys from Latham and Harwick. 3 private security contractors posted along the back wall. Lydia's near the French doors. Halsey says she looks like she's close to breaking. What's on the table? Asset transfer documents. Everything held in your name and Lydia's. Selene wants full signature authority before close of business today. I felt the wire taped against my chest. And if we don't sign, she moves to whatever plan B looks like. Which won't be gentle. The October wind pushed bare branches against the vehicle's roof. Through the gates, security cameras were already tracking our position. Selene would know we'd pulled up. She'd be watching, waiting for me to step into her snare. Except this time the trap had a trap inside it. Conrad. Mick's voice softened. He turned to face me directly, and what I saw in his eyes was something I hadn't expected: genuine concern. After tonight, you understand what you're walking away from. Not just Lydia and Selene. This estate, the life you assembled, the reputation you spent 3 decades building. Even if everything goes right tonight, you'll still lose everything that made you who you believed you were. I looked past him at the house, at the study window where I'd sat with both children, teaching them to read a balance sheet, at the terrace, where Lydia and I had renewed our vows, at the gardens where my mother had once planted roses. I already lost it, I said quietly. The moment Lydia forged my signature 5 years ago. I just hadn't been told yet. Mick reached across and set his hand on my shoulder. After 3 weeks of federal protocols and operational distance, the gesture was so unexpected, it cracked something open in my chest. After tonight, I don't have a family left to speak of, I said. The words came out raw. Callum's in witness protection. My mother won't remember my name by Christmas. Lydia's boarding a flight to Zurich, and Selene I couldn't finish. Mick's grip tightened. What comes next is the moment everything Conrad built, every quiet move, every calculated risk, every sacrifice either holds or shatters completely. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you knew someone close to you was working against you in silence, would you confront them the moment you found out, or would you wait and build your case first? A brief note. Some details that follow have been dramatized to capture the emotional weight of what happened. I stepped out of the car at 4:03 p.m. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. Gravel shifted under my feet as I moved toward the front entrance, never like this before. Never walking into my own home as if crossing enemy lines. The door opened before I got there. Selene stood in the entrance hall, backlit by the crystal chandeliers, dressed in a charcoal suit that made her look like she'd just presided over a boardroom execution. Her expression was immaculate, composed, cool, utterly professional. "Hello, Dad." Not a trace of warmth in it. She might as well have been addressing a delivery driver. "We're in the library. Lydia's already here." I followed her down the hallway, past family portraits and antique furniture, past the grandfather clock that had once been Lydia's mother's. Everything looked precisely as it always had, and nothing would ever be the same. The library doors were open wide. The room had been arranged like a chamber for corporate executions. long mahogany table leather chairs placed with military exactness, floor lamps throwing precise cones of light. Lydia sat near the French doors, hands clasped together, her face a mask, barely holding back controlled panic. Two attorneys in navy suits were positioned on either side of where Celine would sit. Three security contractors, all ex-military, lined the back wall. And at the far end, dressed in a Brooks Brothers suit and carrying a briefcase concealing a federal recording device, sat Special Agent Petra Halsey. She held my gaze for exactly half a second, long enough to confirm she was active, long enough to tell me the wire was running. I looked down at the unsigned contract, then at my daughter's eyes, flat and depthless as a shark's, then at Lydia trembling in her chair, finally grasping too late that her protégé had eclipsed her. Then I smiled. Celine's eyes narrowed. Something funny. "I was just thinking," I said quietly, "about what a brilliant mind you have for finance, Celine. Truly exceptional. But you overlooked one thing. Which is," I held her gaze, "I spent 30 years teaching you to read a ledger." The library went silent. Lydia stared at me as though I'd come unhinged. Celine's two attorneys exchanged a look, and Agent Halsey, Brooks Brothers suit wire running beneath her collar, held my eyes for exactly 1 second. Everything we'd spent 3 weeks constructing came down to whether Celine would take the bait and say the words that would destroy her. The board was clear: 60 seconds to checkmate or annihilation. Celine leaned forward over the polished mahogany and laid out the terms in the same flat corporate monotone she'd used to close billion-dollar mergers, as if threatening to erase my mother and frame me for fraud were simply another line item on a quarterly earnings call. "The terms are non-negotiable." She pushed a second set of documents across the table. "Both signatures verified by 4:15 p.m. The transport team secures Irene for immediate transfer to our Bahamas estate with appropriate medical staff. You board private aircraft for your pre-negotiated plea arrangement, clean, professional, permanent." She paused, letting the silence do its work. Lydia hadn't moved since I'd walked in. Her hands shook in her lap, her eyes darting between Celine and me like she was watching a chess match whose rules she no longer understood. "And the alternative?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Celine's smile stopped short of her eyes. "Hesitate and the complete forged ledger, every fraudulent transaction bearing both your signatures, every wire transfer, every fabricated authorization reaches the Northern District of Illinois by 5 You'll each spend the rest of your natural lives in maximum security federal prison. Your mother lives out her final years in state care. Callum loses everything." I watched her deliver the threat with the same measured calm she'd brought to quarterly earnings presentations. This was my daughter, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike in the gardens beyond these very windows, the woman I'd guided through Harvard Business School, who'd called me every Sunday for investment advice until 5 years ago. Now she sat across from me, mapping out my destruction as though it were a corporate restructuring. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" I said. "I learned from the best." Her voice held nothing. No pride, no grief, nothing. "I need verbal confirmation from both of you that you understand the terms before signatures." Lydia finally spoke, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Celine, please." "Verbal confirmation, Mother." "Yes or no?" I glanced at Agent Halsey. She sat completely still, hands folded on the table before her, the very image of a bored corporate attorney working through routine paperwork. But I caught the slight shift of her right hand toward her suit jacket pocket. "Crystal clear," I said. "You've made your position absolutely transparent." Halsey spoke for the first time since I'd entered the room. "For the record, both parties acknowledge these terms were clearly communicated and understood." Celine nodded, eyes never leaving me. completely transparent, as my father noted. Halsey's hand moved. The motion was barely perceptible, just a faint pressure of her fingers into her jacket pocket, held for 2 seconds, then released. Nobody else in the room caught it. The 2 attorneys were absorbed in the documents. The security contractors stood motionless along the wall. Lydia was staring at her daughter as if seeing her for the first time. But I saw it. Outside, in an unmarked vehicle beyond the iron gates, Mick would be receiving the confirmation signal at that very moment. The transmitter had activated. Halsey had the recording. Every word of Celine's explicit extortion captured on federal wire, witnessed by a sworn AUSA. The trap had closed. Selena reached for a pen and slid it across the table toward Lydia. "We'll start with you, Mother. Sign on page 12 where indicated." Lydia's hand trembled as she lifted the pen. I watched her stare at the signature line at the document that would transfer everything she'd built, everything she'd stolen, into Celine's absolute control. "I taught you better than this," Lydia whispered. Celine's expression didn't move. "No. You taught me exactly this. You taught me that family is leverage, that trust is weakness, that power goes to whoever's willing to do what others won't." She turned to look at me. "Both of you taught me that." I began. She cut me off. "You taught me to read ledgers, Dad. To find the patterns, follow the money, identify the vulnerability. You taught me that every system has a weak point." Her smile went cold. "You just never expected to be the weak point." I held her gaze. "And what's yours, Selene?" For just a moment, something moved behind her eyes. Uncertainty. Or maybe the recognition that she'd said too much, gone too explicit, committed too openly to the extortion. Then it was gone. "I don't have one," she said. "That's what separates us." Agent Halsey shifted almost imperceptibly in her chair. I knew what it meant. The recording was solid. Federal prosecutors would have everything they needed. Explicit threats, extortion conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted witness tampering. Every word Selena had spoken since I stepped into this room was evidence. Selena turned back to Lydia. "Sign the document, Mother." Lydia's pen touched the paper. I watched ink begin forming the first letter of her name. Then Selena's phone vibrated. Once sharp and sudden against the mahogany. She glanced at it, dismissed it, and returned her attention to Lydia's signature. The phone vibrated again. Celine's eyes flicked toward the screen. Then it started, sustained, buzzing, not a single notification, but a cascade. Multiple alerts flooding in at once, the phone chattering against the polished wood like a trapped insect. One of the attorneys looked up. "Everything all right?" Celine reached for the phone with a hand that had lost its steadiness. "One moment. Final verification." I watched her face as she read the screen. Watched corporate confidence begin to fracture. Watched confusion move into her expression. Then something sharper, something that was almost fear. Celine's phone vibrated again. Her thumb scrolled hard through the notifications. I couldn't see the screen, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly what she was reading. Asset freeze notifications. Account access denied. Wire transfer failures. Every carefully constructed shell company, every offshore account, every financial instrument she'd spent 5 years assembling, all of it locked down in real time. Ezra had executed the federal asset freeze the moment Mick sent the signal. Every account we'd been tracking, every entity we'd identified, every dollar Celine believed she controlled, frozen. "What?" Celine's voice had shed its corporate monotone entirely. She looked up at me, then back at the phone. "This isn't another cascade of notifications. I counted silently. 163 seconds. That's how long it takes for an empire built on fraud to disappear. Celine's face moved through corporate confidence to confusion, to something close to panic in the space of 4 seconds, as her phone screen blazed with cascading notifications. I caught the words "asset freeze" before she flipped it face down, but her hand was trembling now, and Agent Halsey was already on her feet, reaching into her jacket for the federal badge that would bring this to its end. Lydia looked between us like she was watching her entire world come apart in real time, which was exactly what was happening. Later, after the badges came out and the handcuffs went on, Ezra walked me through the electronic timeline of precisely what unfolded in the 2 minutes and 43 seconds, while I sat in that library watching Celine's phone begin to shake. We were back in the Lincoln Park basement, the tactical command center that had served as my headquarters for 3 weeks. The monitors still glowed with frozen transaction logs and surveillance feeds. Ezra brought up a screen dense with cascading timestamps, each one marking a strike against Celine's empire. Celine delivered her ultimatum at 4:08 and 10 seconds. Ezra said, highlighting the first entry. 7 seconds later, 4:08 and 17 seconds. Halsey pressed the transmitter button in her pocket. I had the confirmation code before she'd even settled back in her chair. I leaned in, watching him scroll through the execution logs. And you were ready. The Coinbase subpoena had been drafted for 3 weeks. All I needed was Judge Breck's standing emergency order number. Ezra pulled up a document: emergency federal subpoena, Northern District of Illinois. Blank signature line poised for judicial authorization. The moment mixed signal came through, I filled in the case number and transmitted directly to the Coinbase legal team. He showed me the email timestamp, 4:08:34 p.m. 17 seconds after Halsey pressed the button. Your daughter's panic liquidation. Ezra moved to another screen showing cryptocurrency transaction flows. $12 million sitting in a Coinbase Pro Transit vault. She thought she was routing it to Singapore shell accounts. But crypto transfers aren't instant. There's a compliance window while the exchange validates the transaction. I watched the transaction log initiated at 1:47 p.m., still pending final authorization at 4:08 p.m. Coinbase's automated compliance system flagged the federal subpoena at 4:10. Ezra said. Their legal team reviewed Judge Breck's standing order, confirmed the case number matched the Northern District of Illinois Active Investigation Registry, and locked the accounts. He highlighted a line in red. Account freeze executed 4:14:22 p.m. 6 minutes, I said quietly. 6 minutes. $12 million locked in digital amber. Ezra leaned back, arms folded. At that moment I sat back, watched the confirmation turn blood red, and knew the master accounts were dead. But you were still in that library, playing a blind hand. I thought about sitting across from Celine while Ezra was executing this surgical strike hundreds of miles away, while she was sliding contracts across mahogany. Her cryptocurrency empire was being dismantled in real time. Show me Fenwick's timeline. Ezra switched screens, pulling up a parallel log drawn from Harlow Price's debriefing notes. Halsey's validation code cleared the federal system at 4:08 and 21 seconds, 4 seconds after my terminal received it. Fenwick was waiting in her office with a secure video link already live to Judge Aldous Breck. Judge Aldous Breck, 62, Northern District of Illinois, appointed by a Republican president and confirmed with bipartisan support because nobody questioned his methodical brilliance. Fenwick had worked with him on emergency asset seizures before and knew he could cut through complex financial evidence faster than most judges could read a parking ticket. Fenwick submitted the emergency asset freeze motion backed by your blockchain trace and Halsey's live extortion confirmation. Ezra showed me the motion document. Comprehensive 37 pages of evidence transaction, Flo's shell company structures all assembled across 3 weeks of investigation. Breck reviewed the statutory elements for 90 seconds and stamped it. Ezra pulled up a video timestamp secure federal court feed, Judge Breck in chambers working through documents on screen, while Fenwick waited via video link. I studied the judge's face, impassive, methodical, the look of a man who'd cataloged every variation of financial crime and knew precisely what he was seeing. The timestamp showed Breck's digital signature appearing on the document at 4:11:03 p.m. Emergency Federal Asset Freeze Order Number 2024 CF0891, Ezra said. Hit the Federal Registry at 4:11:09. Synchronized with Treasury, the DOJ moved immediately to quarantine the entire global financial infrastructure. He brought up a network diagram, Cascade Vanguard Apex Holdings. Apex Meridian Capital Management 7 offshore shell networks, spanning the Cayman Islands, Singapore, Hong Kong, Bahamas. Red lockdown indicators spread across the map like a contagion. 83 million, I said, reading the total. $83 million frozen across 4 jurisdictions in 2 minutes 43 seconds. Ezra held my gaze. From Halsey's confirmation signal to complete asset quarantine 243. 2 parallel strikes. One technical, one legal, converging on a woman who believed she owned the board. I walked to the window overlooking the Lincoln Park street. Outside, the October evening had settled into darkness. Somewhere across town, Celine was being processed into federal custody. Lydia was in a separate holding facility, her Zurich flight permanently grounded. Callum was in witness protection. My mother was safe in her memory care facility, unaware her family had imploded. "Show me the convergence," I said. Ezra pulled up synchronized timelines on the main monitor, 3 parallel tracks. My vantage point in the library. Ezra's execution in the basement. Fenwick's legal strike at the Northern District. 4:08:10 p.m. Celine delivers extortion ultimatum in library. 4:08:17 p.m. Halsey presses transmitter button. 4:08:21 p.m. Fenwick receives validation code. 4:08:34 p.m. Ezra transmits Coinbase subpoena. 4:10:42 p.m. Coinbase legal team reviews subpoena. 4:11:03 p.m. Judge Breck signs emergency asset freeze order. 4:11:09 p.m. Celine's phone begins vibrating. 4:14:22 p.m. Coinbase executes account freeze. I stared at the timeline. While Celine was threatening to erase my mother, Ezra was killing her crypto. While she slid contracts across mahogany, Fenwick was getting Breck's signature. While she delivered her ultimatum with corporate precision, her empire was being systematically disassembled by federal machinery she never saw coming. 2 minutes, 43 seconds. Her empire died faster than it had taken her to issue the threat. She stood in that library completely unaware, Ezra said quietly. Thought she controlled the room. Thought she held all the leverage. Thought family was her weapon. I turned from the window. She learned that from her mother, and now they're both in federal custody. Ezra brought up another screen, one showing message metadata I hadn't seen before. There's one more thing you need to see. The warning text that tipped us off about the layout change. I traced the metadata. He highlighted a sender profile, IP routing logs, device fingerprints. "You're not going to believe who sent it," Ezra said, and rotated the monitor toward me. Celine's phone vibrated again at 4:11 p.m. I watched her face move from confusion to comprehension, to something approaching genuine fear as the words, "Access denied Federal Order Number 2024 CF0891, blazed across the screen in blood red. She stared at it for 3 seconds. Then her thumb moved with practiced speed, opening the Vanguard Apex Holdings app. The interface loaded showed her portfolio overview, then displayed the same message in larger font access: denied assets frozen by federal order. No, she whispered. The word came out barely audible. Her fingers flew across the screen. Cayman routing app, frozen Treasury compliance hold. Singapore shell account access, suspended federal investigation. She pulled a hardware ledger wallet from her briefcase, connected it to her phone with shaking hands. The screen flashed network sync error assets retained by federal custodian. I watched her work through each account in sequence. Watched the color drain from her face. Watched her corporate composure, the same measured precision she'd deployed to deliver her extortion ultimatum, crack like ice giving way under pressure. Access denied, she said, her voice rising. All of them. Cayman, Singapore, Switzerland, every single account. Lydia leaned forward. What are you talking about? Celine turned the phone toward her mother, hand trembling. $83 million, gone. Frozen. The two attorneys exchanged glances. One pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. The other leaned toward Celine. Miss Avery, I need to advise you that a federal asset seizure is in progress. How? Celine cut him off, turning to face me. The cold calculation had left her eyes entirely. For the first time since I'd walked into that library, I saw something real on my daughter's face. How did you? I warned you, Celine. My voice came out quieter than I'd intended. You studied the ledger but forgot who built the infrastructure. She stared at me as though I were speaking another language. Then slow comprehension settled across her features. You've been tracking everything since the beginning. Since the moment I realized Lydia forged my signature 5 years ago. Celine's phone buzzed again. More notifications, more red warnings. She looked down at the screen, then back at me. And for the first time in years, maybe the first time since she was a child, I saw tears form in my daughter's eyes. 83 million, she whispered. Gone. How? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She was sharp enough to work it out, the federal investigation, the asset tracking, the 3 weeks I'd spent constructing an airtight case, while she believed I was scrambling to keep myself out of prison. Agent Halsey remained perfectly motionless in her chair, hands folded, taking in everything with the practiced observation of someone who'd testified in hundreds of trials. Lydia's voice broke the silence. Celine, what did you do? Celine laughed, a sharp, brittle sound with no humor in it. What did I do? I learned from you, Mother. I learned that family is leverage, that power belongs to whoever is willing to use it. I absorbed every lesson you ever gave me. You taught me everything, Celine said. Her tears had stopped. The emotional fracture was closing over, replaced by something harder, something broken beyond repair. And now we're both. The library doors swung open. Mick Beaumont stepped through, flanked by 4 federal agents in dark suits. No sirens, no theatrical announcement. Just the steady beat of boots on hardwood and the rustle of papers in Mick's hand. The corporate lawyers retreated from Celine as if she'd turned radioactive phones already out hunting for independent representation. Mick walked to the head of the table and positioned himself directly across from Celine. Selina Avery, you are under arrest for federal extortion under 18 U.S.C. Section 1949, International Money Laundering, Obstruction of Justice, RICO conspiracy, and aggravated identity theft. He paused, let the charges settle, then turned to Lydia. Lydia Avery, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering based on evidence recovered from the Loop Hotel meeting with Alexei Orlov and your planned flight to Zurich under a false identity. Lydia's face went white. What? Agent Halsey rose from her chair, reached into her jacket, and produced an FBI shield. Special Agent Petra Halsey, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every word of your extortion attempt is on federal recording, Ms. Avery, as is your mother's coordination of offshore fund transfers and escape planning. One of the attorneys was already on his phone. This is Michael Brennan. I need to retain independent counsel for... He moved quickly toward the door. The 3 security contractors along the back wall hadn't shifted position, but their expressions had moved from professional vigilance to careful neutrality. They weren't stepping into the path of federal arrests. Mick nodded to the agents. 2 of them approached Selena, handcuffs drawn. Steel clicked around her wrists with mechanical precision. Selene didn't resist. She stood calmly, let them secure the cuffs, then turned to look at me one final time. You won, Dad. Her voice held no anger, no fear, just hollow observation. But look around. You lost everything else. Was this what winning looked like? Handcuffs on my daughter, federal charges on my ex-wife, and a library full of strangers watching my family come apart. 2 more agents moved toward Lydia. She pulled back instinctively, then seemed to grasp the futility. I want my attorney, she said, voice trembling. I want... You'll have full access to legal counsel, Mick said, once you're processed. Lydia looked at me as the cuffs closed around her wrists. Her expression carried something I couldn't quite name, hatred maybe, or devastation, or some fused version of both. 22 years, she said quietly. Was it worth it? I had no answer. Mick came to me as the agents began steering Celine and Lydia toward the doors. Your original charges are dismissed with prejudice. You're free, Conrad. Free, I repeated. The word tasted like ash. That's what we were calling this. Through the French windows, I could see October rain beginning to fall. The agents led Selene and Lydia out into the darkness, steel cuffs catching the light. Celine's final words hung in the air like an indictment I couldn't appeal. You won, Dad, but you lost everything else. I stood in that silent library, surrounded by abandoned contracts and retreating attorneys, free from federal charges and utterly alone, turning over whether the woman I'd spent 3 weeks dismantling had told me the truth in her last 60 seconds of freedom. I found Lydia alone in the vast living room 20 minutes after they took Celine away, settled into a wingback chair, staring out at the churning bay as though she were waiting for a sunken ship to surface and carry her somewhere beyond the federal government's reach. The room felt cavernous without the corporate lawyers and security contractors. Just Lydia, the October storm beating against the French windows, and the weight of 22 years collapsing into silence. Mick came in behind me carrying a manila folder. He stopped beside Lydia's chair and opened it with professional efficiency. Your Zurich flight has a federal no-fly flag, he said, voice level. Swiss International Air 27 departing Dulles tomorrow at 7:22 a.m. under the name Margaret Dunbar. TSA will detain you at security. Every Apex Meridian Capital asset is frozen into federal receivership. The Loop Hotel audio you offering to betray Celine for an offshore split with Alexei Orlov is logged in the Northern District of Illinois evidence vault. Lydia didn't look away from the window, didn't flinch at words that meant her carefully constructed escape plan had collapsed as completely as Celine's empire. The Margaret Dunbar passport cost me $50,000, she said quietly. British forgery. Very good work. Not good enough, Mick said. She laughed a sound, without joy, without hope. Nothing was good enough, was it? I thought I'd planned for everything. Thought I'd taught Celine to be smarter than me. Thought... Her voice broke. I actually believed she loved me enough to let me run with her. The sentence hung there. I couldn't tell whether she meant Celine or me. Mick closed the folder, set it on the side table, and stepped back, giving me room for whatever this moment was meant to be. I walked to Lydia's chair and stood looking down at my wife of 22 years. The woman who had forged my signature 5 years ago and set all of this in motion. The woman who had taught our daughter that family was leverage and trust was weakness. Her face held no anger now. No appeals for mercy, no protestations of innocence, just a deep terminal exhaustion. I know, I said quietly. Then I turned and walked out of that house for the last time. The stone porch overlooking the bay was slick with rain. The wind carried salt water and dying leaves. Mick joined me after a minute, standing in a silence that felt earned across 25 years of knowing each other, first as business associates, then as something closer to family than the family I'd actually had. Judge Breck just signed the order vacating pretrial confinement, Mick said, sliding a document into my coat pocket. Ankle monitor goes offline at midnight. You're a free man, Conrad. I looked down at my left hand. The gold wedding band I'd worn for 22 years caught the gray, rain-dulled light. Slowly, I worked the ring off my finger. It felt lighter than it should have. Should have carried more weight after 2 decades, after 2 children, after building an empire and watching it burn. I set it on the wet stone railing. The gold band held the rain for 1 second, then tipped sideways and dropped into the dark ivy climbing the mansion wall. 22 years gone in the time it takes to exhale. Mick said nothing, no judgment, no commentary. You hungry? He asked finally. The question was so unexpected, so ordinary after federal arrests and family wreckage that I nearly laughed. Starving. There's a little place out in Wilmette, Mick said. Looks like it should have been condemned back in 1985. Best clam chowder on the coast. Lead the way. We walked to Mick's FBI vehicle in the circular driveway, the unmarked sedan that had carried me from Lincoln Park to the Lake Geneva estate, from one life to whatever came next. I settled into the passenger seat, felt the leather still warm from the drive up. Through the windshield, I could see the iron gates of the estate gates that had watched arrivals and departures across decades, the gardens where my mother had planted roses, the windows where I had taught my children to dream. All of it evidence now. All of it federal property pending asset forfeiture proceedings. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, the secure device Ezra had given me 3 weeks ago for encrypted communications. Unknown number, text message. The screen showed 3 sentences. Avery, Orlov cleared Geneva checkpoint. I have exact coordinates. Want to finish ledger, call this line. RG. I stared at the initials. Rupert Gentry. The most terrified cooperating witness I'd ever encountered. The man who had shaken through his deposition, voice cracking as he described offshore transactions and shell company structures. The accountant who'd worked for Lydia and Celine, keeping meticulous records while understanding precisely how criminal every entry was. The man whose daughter Zara had somehow inherited none of his fear and all of his precision. What kind of coward raises a daughter who won't stop fighting? Now Rupert was offering me Alexei Orlov's exact location. The final conspirator, the man who had helped Lydia forge my signatures and engineer the offshore accounts. The ghost who'd slipped out of the Loop Hotel and vanished into the international banking system. The last thread in a conspiracy that had cost me everything. Mick glanced at my phone, then at me. Rupert Gentry. You want to pursue it? I looked at the text again. With those 3 words, finish the ledger. Ezra had reached for that phrase 3 weeks back, the night he'd first laid the blockchain traces in front of me. Fenwick had invoked it when immunity was on the table. Celine had wielded it when she threatened to dump forged documents on the Northern District. The ledger. The complete reckoning. The final accounting of who owed what to whom. The most terrified man I ever met somehow raised a daughter who won't stop fighting, I said. Maybe that counts for something. Maybe it means fear and courage aren't two sides of a coin, Mick said. Maybe it just means seeing exactly what something will cost you and going ahead regardless. I flipped the phone face down against my thigh. Beyond the glass, October rain was punishing the estate grounds. Inside, federal agents moved through room after room, photographing, cataloging, bagging evidence. Lydia sat in the living room, waiting on a transport van to federal custody. Selena was already in a holding cell somewhere in Chicago. Callum was in witness protection. My mother was in memory care, spending her evening in peaceful oblivion, while the family she'd raised came apart at the seams. Here I sat, riding in an FBI sedan, with a text on my phone dangling Alexei Orlov's Geneva coordinates, like the last card in a hand I'd been playing for 3 weeks. I turned Rupert Gentry's initials over in my mind, and the question attached to them, want to finish the ledger. I still didn't have the answer. I put a call through to Rupert Gentry's unlisted number, as Mick's vehicle moved past the Lake Geneva estate boundary. The voice that picked up bore no resemblance to the wreck of a man who'd shaken his way through the Rosemont deposition. This was someone who had kept one piece of the puzzle in reserve and was ready to surrender it. Avery. Measured unhurried. You received my message. You said you have Orlov's location. Geneva, but the location is almost beside the point. Paper rustled somewhere behind him. 3 weeks ago, Zara got into an encrypted email she had no business reading. She borrowed my login while I stepped out of the room and walked the file out on a USB drive I didn't even know existed. Mick flicked a look my way, then returned his eyes to the highway as we funneled into the lanes toward Washington. Rain drove hard at the windshield. What did the email contain? I asked. Orders to extract Orlov. Rupert's voice was deliberate. He didn't disappear because he was afraid of the Bureau. Someone at the top of the PMC network pulled him out of the loop operation on purpose, tasked him with standing up a secondary global logistics corridor to replace the Vanguard Apex infrastructure your investigation was about to demolish. Those words landed somewhere cold behind my sternum. A backup route. They mapped your progress, knew Celine's network was going down eventually. So they built a contingency, fresh shells, new accounts, different intermediaries. Orlov's role in Geneva is to manage the handoff and get the new architecture operational. Mick's grip on the wheel changed, a subtle tightening that I'd learned to read over 25 years. The route logs are moving to Mick's terminal right now, Rupert said. Zara cracked the encryption last week. I wiped my copies 5 minutes ago. Anything that surfaces from here forward lives in federal custody and nowhere else. Mick's dash screen bloomed with incoming files, column after column of spreadsheets, transaction records, encoded correspondence. Too dense to absorb at speed, but fragments surfaced as they scrolled account strings, routing identifiers, entity names I'd never encountered during 3 weeks of digging. Rupert, I said, keeping my voice low, what's driving this? Why now? A gap of 3 seconds. Zara. The word came out like a full sentence. She went through every page of those files and told me flatly that somebody had to end it. When I said the risk was too high, she told me fear was just a signal about danger, not a standing reason to stay silent. I sat with that for a moment. Zara Gentry, 26 years old junior accountant, rifling through her own father's files with full knowledge of what discovery would mean. Nice she gets that from you, I said. Rupert made a sound that was half laugh, half grief. She gets it from her mother. What I gave her was the ability to read a balance sheet. Mick's voice arrived low and edged. The Swiss coordinator running logistics for Orlov's new route, initials AC. A beat of silence from Rupert. Correct. Senior level. Well insulated. Something shifted in Mick's register, a tone I'd heard from him exactly twice, both times, before something irreversible happened. I know who that is. I turned to look at him. His face was set, jaw forward, gaze nailed to the road, the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head with very high stakes. He was in your DOD chain of command, Mick said 12 years ago. You signed his performance review. You're the one who put him up for promotion. The name dropped into place without effort. Alden Crosby. Exceptional instincts for logistics, the kind of composure that doesn't bend under operational pressure, an officer built to run supply chains across multiple continents and never register the strain. And now he was steering Alexei Orlov's exit and holding together the PMC's reconstituted network. Conrad, I'm sorry. Rupert's voice came through the line, frayed at the edges. I've seen what it does to a man when people he trusted turn on him. Lydia, Celine, I watched it happen. A long pause. I'm sorry. Don't carry that, I told him. What you just handed us closes the book. I ended the call. Mick and I left the silence alone for 40 minutes. As Washington drew closer, the rain surrendered to something thinner, a drifting mist that wrapped the streetlights in halos and gave the city an underwater quality. Lincoln Park at 11 p.m. Ezra was in the basement taking apart the command post with the thoroughness of someone who'd already written the after-action report in his head. Power leads wound into nylon bags, screens going black in sequence. 3 weeks of operational infrastructure, the Lincoln Park basement, that had been the nerve center of everything reduced methodically to vacant surfaces and dead equipment. The full encrypted archive reached Fenwick's desk 20 minutes ago, Ezra said, not pausing in his work. Everything packaged tight. 3 weeks of material, blockchain traces, surveillance records, Rupert's root data, Zara's decrypted files. She has what she needs to run RICO up the entire PMC chain. I lowered myself into the chair at the worn desk and watched the last screens go dark. 4 monitors that had once displayed live transaction flows, surveillance angles, asset movements in real time, all of it extinguished now. When I brought you into this, I couldn't promise you anything, I said. You stayed anyway. Why? Ezra set down a cable and straightened. Men who are guilty pick the route that makes them look clean. You picked the route that would prove the truth, no matter the cost. That told me everything I needed to know. The last monitor went dark. The final cables disappeared into bags. And for the first time across 21 days, there was nothing left to solve. One loose thread, Ezra said from the foot of the stairs. That Wharton IP embedded in the Excel file, the thread that pulled us to Callum's identity theft evidence. I'm close to pinning down how Zara pulled it off the Apex Meridian Capital server. One more contact to clear, then I'll bring you the name. He hoisted his bag. Sleep, Conrad. You have the look of someone who just survived something. I did, I said. Yeah. A tired, unguarded smile from Ezra. You also won. His steps crossed the floor above, deliberate and fading. The front door opened and closed, and the latch caught with the small, conclusive sound of something finished. I was alone in the Lincoln Park basement at 11:47 p.m. 4 dead screens, bare desk, phone gone quiet. The room that had consumed 18 hours of every day for 3 weeks, where the case that dismantled my family and redeemed my name had been assembled piece by piece, was now just a dark basement. Cold coffee smell. Silence. 21 days of forward motion, and now no direction to move in. No calculation pending, no next vulnerability to map. Only the dark, and the sound of my own breathing and whatever winning is supposed to feel like when it's hollow. I thought of Celine locked into federal processing, Lydia facing trial, Callum sheltered somewhere under a different name, my mother at her care facility watching the evening pass in blessed unawareness. I thought of Mick somewhere out on an October highway closing the distance to Alden Crosby, with the methodical patience of a man for whom professional betrayal was something personal. I thought of Rupert Gentry, a man paralyzed by fear who somehow produced a daughter who knew how to act in spite of it. I thought about the span of 22 years, the marriage, the enterprise, the whole structure of a shared life that turned out to have forgery at its foundation. And I sat there with the arithmetic finally complete, the weight of what was gained and what was gone pressing in equal measure, asking myself what exactly becomes of a man who wins everything and walks out of it by himself. Monday morning, I went to the federal courthouse in the one clean navy suit Lydia had left behind when she drained the accounts, cleared the security checkpoint as a man arriving to reclaim a name, not answer for one. The answer to that question turned out to be this. He shows up the next morning. Harlow Price was waiting outside the courtroom doors in his crisp cobalt blue bow tie, wearing the expression of someone who'd been holding a winning hand for 12 years and had finally been told to lay it down. Fenwick reached me at 7:00 a.m., he said. Get your client there by 10 Zulkru. She's not wasting time. How little time. Dismissal with prejudice. We pushed through the courtroom doors at 9:58 a.m. Judge Aldous Breck occupied the bench, moving through documents with the same unhurried exactness I'd observed on the secure court feed when his signature had materialized on the emergency asset freeze order. AUSA Fenwick stood at the prosecution table, folder spread, expression giving away nothing. The gallery was nearly empty, no reporters staking positions, no observers filling the rows. Just the quiet gears of the federal system turning. All rise, the bailiff said. Judge Breck raised his eyes from the page. Mr. Avery, please approach. I moved to stand at the defense table beside Harlow, the ankle monitor pressed against my leg with a weight that had grown heavier across 3 weeks, the constant reminder that I'd been surveilled as a criminal while piecing together the evidence that would prove I was not. Ms. Fenwick, Judge Breck said. Fenwick rose to her feet. Your Honor, the United States moves to dismiss all pending counts against Conrad Harlan Avery on the basis of forensic evidence establishing identity theft, fabricated documentation, and a complete absence of culpability. The defendant was the target of a sophisticated conspiracy executed by family members who had access to his credentials and financial infrastructure. She placed a document before the bench. Breck reviewed it for exactly 5 seconds. The gavel came down one sharp, absolute crack. Motion granted. All charges dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Avery, you are free to go. A pretrial officer stepped forward carrying a small key. She crouched beside my chair and unlatched the heavy black ankle monitor from my right leg. The device came off with a metallic click that sounded to me like a cell door swinging open rather than shut. She passed it to the bailiff, and I looked down at my ankle. A pale, deep groove ringed the skin where the monitor had sat for 3 weeks, a mark that would need weeks to disappear. Harlow leaned close and murmured, 12 years in federal defense. I've never watched Fenwick execute a dismissal that quickly. You shattered her record. Fenwick came over as we collected our papers. Mr. Avery, I regret what you were put through. The evidentiary package your team put together was extraordinary. Civilian investigation rarely reaches that level of rigor. Thank you, I said. She held for a moment, then, your daughter and ex-wife will go to trial within 6 months. If your testimony is required, my office will coordinate through Mr. Price. I nodded, couldn't find words. The thought of taking the stand against Selene and Lydia, of sitting in a federal courtroom and walking through their conspiracy under oath, sat in my chest like something too dense to lift. Fenwick left. Harlow squeezed my shoulder. "You hungry? There's a place nearby with a breakfast burrito that will recalibrate your entire sense of what food can be." "Raincheck," I said. "There's someone I need to see first." I found Imani Thorpe at a coffee shop 2 blocks from Dirksen Plaza, right where her assistant said she'd be. Corner table laptop open, an espresso going cold beside her, while she typed with the tunnel focus of someone burning through a deadline. She looked up as I drew near. Recognition moved across her face, then gave way to professional caution. "Mr. Avery." "Ms. Thorpe." I gestured toward the empty chair. "May I?" She shut the laptop. "Of course." I sat, flagged down a server, and ordered black coffee, then turned to face the journalist who had published the story that dismantled my reputation 3 weeks before. "The work you did was excellent," I said. "Every word you ran was accurate. The failure wasn't your reporting. It was my blind spots. I kept telling myself my daughter wasn't the one running the operation." Imani studied me for 3 seconds. "I understand the charges were dropped this morning." "With prejudice, 10 minutes ago." "Congratulations." She produced a small recorder and set it on the table between us. "Formal statement, front page, exclusive, exonerated, executive, cleared, name, that sort of angle." I shook my head. "The financial record makes the case on its own. It doesn't need my voice attached." She smiled faintly. "Most people in your position would want the public vindication." "Legal vindication is enough." Imani settled back, watching me with the calibrated patience of someone who had sat across from hundreds of sources and learned to distinguish the ones who were concealing something from the ones who were simply done. Then she angled forward, voice falling. "Off the record, genuinely off. No attribution, nothing published. Can I share something about my original source?" I held still. "Please." "It wasn't a prosecutorial leak," she said. "The first tip I received about your indictment came through an untraceable call. Burner phone routed through 3 VPNs. Young woman's voice. She knew Vanguard Apex internal architecture, at a level only an insider could account, structures, shell company designations, transaction patterns that hadn't even surfaced in the federal filing yet. Young female voice. Before the warrants. Zara. "When did the call come in?" I asked. "October 4th, the day before your arrest." The pieces settled into alignment. Zara Gentry hadn't merely leaked material to help her frightened father cooperate with investigators. She hadn't just pocketed those Wharton USB files as reactive self-protection. She had triggered the entire exposure herself. She'd contacted Imani Thorpe before the FBI had drafted a single warrant, before Rupert broke, before I had any idea I was being set up. "Thank you," I said quietly. Imani tilted her head. "You know who she is." Not quite a question. "I have a working theory," I said. "I need to confirm it." I walked out of the coffee shop and stood on the pavement while the Chicago morning moved past me. Pedestrians, traffic, October sun, cutting through cloud cover, the city processing itself with complete indifference to private victories and private ruins. I thought about Ezra's mention of one final contact to clear, before he could hand me the name, of how Zara had pulled the Wharton IP, but I already knew. Zara Gentry had been the architect of this exposure from the very start. She'd fed Imani the initial story, lifted her father's insurance files, sent the anonymous warnings about Selene's layout changes. The question wasn't how. The question was why a 26-year-old Wharton graduate would incinerate her own family to rescue someone she had never once met. Tuesday morning, I sat at my own kitchen table in Lincoln Park with fresh black coffee and the windows open, watching the first sunrise in 22 days that I was seeing from ground level rather than from behind a monitor screen with an ankle bracelet logging my position. The house had been hollowed out. Lydia had worked through it with systematic thoroughness, furniture stripped, artwork pulled from walls, even the good silverware gone from the drawers. She'd left the kitchen table behind. Probably couldn't wedge it into the car alongside the offshore account numbers and the forged passport. I drank my coffee and watched October leaves drift through the open window. Real leaves, not surveillance feeds. Real light, not monitor glow. Free, exonerated, alone. 3 words that ought to feel like victory. My phone went off at 8:15 a.m., Harlow Price. Conrad news on Gentry, he said with the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered outcomes like these on a regular basis. Executed a federal plea with the Northern District this morning. Government waives active prison time in exchange for complete unredacted testimony against the remaining PMC directors. I put down my coffee. He's not going to prison, not behind bars, no. But the structural penalties are total. Permanent bar from public service, federal pension, stripped immediate restitution of $180,000 in bribe payments, and 3 years committed to the federal witness stand. I thought about Rupert Gentry trembling through his deposition, shaking hands, voice barely under control. 3 years as a federal witness meant 3 years of that terror intensified by every cross-examination from every attorney looking for a crack in his account. Fenwick told me if we'd been able to prove he had explicit knowledge of what was in those weapons, manifests no cooperation deal on earth would have kept him out of a cell. Harlow continued. His ignorance, willful as it was technically, spared him. I looked out toward the Lincoln Park morning. Gentry didn't know, I said slowly. He was greedy and he was willfully blind. He chose not to ask the questions that might have cost him the bribes. And that earns him some mercy. Apparently so. Harlow paused. Fenwick wants to schedule your witness deposition for Celine and Lydia's trial, probably mid-November. Are you ready for that? Was I ready to sit in a federal courtroom and testify against my own daughter and my ex-wife? To lay it out under oath how they'd forged my name, how they'd built a case against me out of fabricated documents. I'll be ready, I said. How are you holding up, Conrad? Honestly, I looked around the gutted kitchen at the bare walls where framed photographs had hung. I'm sitting in my own house drinking coffee I made for myself. 3 weeks ago, I wasn't certain I'd get to do that again. That's not actually an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. I ended the call and sat with Rupert Gentry's reckoning signed and officially recorded. No prison. His willful blindness had saved him barely. How does the same family produce a man who pocketed bribes and looked the other way, and a daughter who burned the whole arrangement down to expose it? I thought about Zara Gentry, 26, Wharton graduate junior accountant. She'd had access to the same offshore accounts, the same shell company filings her father had signed, without inquiry. But where Rupert had chosen not to ask, Zara had chosen to answer. She'd reached out to Imani Thorpe before the FBI had drafted warrants, before I was in custody, before her father found his nerve. She had set the entire chain of exposure in motion, and I still had no idea why. I sat in a plastic chair at the Metropolitan Detention Center on Wednesday afternoon, looking at my daughter through 3 inches of bulletproof glass. For 5 full minutes, neither of us lifted the handset. Ezra's promised confirmation had never arrived. Instead, Celine's legal team had executed a formal waiver permitting this unsupervised visit. She was dressed in federal orange that made her appear younger than 28. No makeup, no corporate composure, just my daughter, a concrete room, and 20 years of potential sentencing between us. Finally, she reached for the handset. I picked up mine. "You came," she said. Her voice was hollow, but it held. "I assumed you wanted to watch me ask for forgiveness." "No," I said quietly. "Because whatever the indictment says, you're still my daughter." Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite emotion, more like the registration of a variable she hadn't accounted for. "I won't apologize for what I tried to do," she said. "You taught me to play the game completely, or not at all. I played completely. I know. But—" her voice cracked for the first time. "I'm sorry I didn't calculate how deeply it would tear you apart. That was a blind spot. Was it a failure of strategic modeling? I looked at my daughter, describing her scheme to frame me for federal crimes as a failure of strategic modeling, and understood that this was the nearest thing to genuine feeling I would ever receive from her. You possess a mind more brilliant than I anticipated, Celine," I said, "and a soul far darker than I feared." I hung up the phone. She watched me rise, watched me turn toward the door, and she didn't call me back. I met Zara Gentry at a Logan Square cafe Thursday morning. She was smaller than I'd pictured, maybe 5'4". Oversized green sweater, wire-rimmed glasses slipping down her nose. She carried the acute terror of someone who'd done the right thing and was now waiting for the consequences to find her. "Mr. Avery." She rose when I approached, nearly upsetting her coffee. "Thank you for meeting me." "Sit," I said gently. "Please." "I was Celine's Wharton classmate," she said. "Junior year." I accidentally saw an unencrypted ledger on her laptop. "Vanguard Apex Holdings, your name on documents I knew you'd never signed." I stayed silent for months, terrified. "Then I saw your arrest on the news." She gripped her coffee cup like it was the only solid object left in the world. "I used my father's security key to open his locked desk, clone the USB he'd hidden, transmitted raw logs to your server called Imani Thorpe to ensure an independent entity held the facts." "You understand what you've done to your own family?" I asked. She nodded. "My father faces 3 years as a federal witness. My mother won't speak to me. I'll probably never work in finance again." She held my gaze. But I did what was right. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "The walls aren't going to close, Zara. I promise you that." She began to cry, quiet, exhausted tears that looked as though they'd been waiting weeks to fall. I left her with Imani's contact information, her coffee, and her fierce, uncompromising courage. The first Sunday of November, I walked into my mother's room at Lakeside Memory Care. No federal agents logging my mileage, no ankle bracelet counting my steps, nothing left to conceal. Just a son visiting his mother the way I had done every week for 8 years. Irene's eyes tracked my movement with that flicker of recognition that came and went, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She was 84, fragile as paper, but her smile was the same one I had known my entire life. "Connie," she said, "you look completely steady again." I wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders. "I am steady, Mom. The work is done." Nurse Celeste entered, carrying a crystal vase filled with pristine white gardenias. "Oh, Mr. Avery, a courier dropped these this morning," she said, setting the vase on the windowsill. "No return address. White gardenias, your mother's absolute favorite." I crossed to the flowers slowly. White gardenias, a deeply private detail known only to the inner Avery family circle. Lydia knew. Callum knew. Selena knew. I found the card nestled among the stems. 3 words in handwriting I recognized immediately. "Forgive me, Grandma." Selena had sent flowers from Federal Holding arranged through her attorney's office on a final errand before the legal team withdrew. She had chosen the exact flowers that would carry meaning to the one person in our family who still loved her without calculation or condition. I sat with my mother until she fell asleep, the gardenias gathering the afternoon light, and I didn't tell her they were from the granddaughter awaiting trial for trying to destroy me. Monday morning, I met Ezra at an Old Town Evanston cafe on King Street. He nursed a giant cold brew concentrate, his preferred breakfast, regardless of the professional setting. Fenwick had extended a formal offer, he said. Wants me as senior forensic blockchain consultant for the Northern District of Illinois Cybercrime Unit. I smiled. Are you accepting the badge? Ezra deadpanned, still evaluating terms. The manual has a strict prohibition against carbonated beverages at main workstations. I broke into loud, genuine laughter, a sound I hadn't produced in years. It felt like a resurrection. Ezra's phone flashed a high-priority alert. Mick sent an operational flash. Alexei Orlov was arrested 40 minutes ago in Geneva by Interpol. Swiss intermediary AC self-surrendered to U.S. Embassy Bern with a complete international PMC corporate registry. I nodded slowly. No surprise, no triumph, just the quiet acknowledgement that the final pieces had fallen exactly as they should. It's done, I said. It's done. Ezra agreed. Tuesday morning at 5:00 a.m. I sat at my kitchen counter with fresh black coffee and the Wall Street Journal. The Washington Post headline read, Vanguard Apex Capital Fund dismantled in major federal enforcement action. Below it, a photograph of Zara Gentry descending the Dirksen Plaza courthouse steps, chin up, shoulders back. I unlocked the drawer, drew out the appointment document, and signed it with my grandfather's fountain pen. Conrad Harlan Avery. My phone buzzed. Mixed text, welcome back to line, Mr. Advisor. And that is where the story settles, not with noise, not with a collapse, but with a man sitting at his kitchen counter at 5 a.m, signing his own name back into his own life. What this cost is not easy to measure. A 22-year marriage. A daughter whose brilliance became a weapon turned inward on the family that raised her. A son whose name was stolen while he slept. There were months when I believed God was the only one who knew the full shape of what had been done and the full shape of what it would take to survive it. Some wounds don't heal clean. They close over something permanent, something you carry differently from then on. But what survives, what actually lasts, is integrity. Not the performance of it. The practice of it quietly when no one is watching and everything is on the line. Here is what I would tell anyone walking a similar road. Document everything. Not because you plan to go to war, but because the truth needs a witness, and sometimes you are the only one available. If someone's loyalty has never been tested, do not assume it is solid. Watch what people do when the cost of honesty becomes real. When betrayal comes from inside your own home, do not rush toward confrontation. Patience applied correctly is the sharpest instrument you own. And never confuse a person's capability with their character. The two can live very far apart. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone carrying a weight they haven't named yet. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Father's Silent Revenge. There are more stories here, each one true in the ways that matter most. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next one.